what's up? Just loaded up already. I can show off the deer animations that I have so far. There's no turning animations yet, so it still looks pretty wonky if I hold the right mouse button down, but it's all set up with variables from the blueprint. And it tilts with the landscape. There's a little bit of a problem wherein the mesh actually rotates. Maybe, oh, I should make it change the active rotation of the whole thing. That would probably be better. Yeah, it's actually the whole actor, it's not the mesh. So why is it tilting from back here? Like where that is. I guess it's not, probably isn't. Maybe I'm just a little bit off with my number here. If I could get it closer. Oh, you know what? Really? Okay, there. Instrumental. What the fuck? What the fuck with the tool thing? Huh. All I have is playlists. Guess that'll do. Wake up.
So ride. Right back to school. Say, look back, I sift through all the clicks. Rolling the halls all year, making me sick. While everyone's out trying to make the cut. What? Then when you think you know me right, I switch it up. Behind the wall, smoking cigarettes and sipping vodka. I'm a fist to catch a cab, ain't no one can stop us.
What is the world location of the mesh? Okay. I think that fixed it. I don't know how I'm supposed to test. But basically what was happening is it was rotating it. And then once it rotated, its origin point would be different. I think that's fine. Woo! Yeah, this is Unreal Engine. No, all Blueprint. Sorry, I didn't see any of that. Blueprint looks like a Cuddly King's code room in Ralph the First. What? You raise a course. What do you mean? Yeah, I love programming with this. It's so fun. Text looks like a mess to me now. I just don't need any of that now. I spent so long trying to figure that out last night, and I could have just done this. I'm such a noob. That's why I shouldn't work late. Never force yourself to work more. You'll figure it out in 2 seconds the next day. What the fuck? Oh, I haven't seen this music video in so long.
high water is a just need dancers.
This is your golden ticket. Seize that moment when it comes.
Okay.
Like I want to say, like your eyes do. We are two stairs.
There's no backing up animation. Ah, there you go. Walk back.
Can say new life break away tonight. I feel
Close it somehow. Okay, so it'll be back, left, forward, right, back. That makes sense. Okay. And then I have idle, walk, trot, gallop. So actually, this one needs to be 3. That should be good.
you can see the core break away. 'Cause tonight I feel
Oh wait, actually no, I need this to be this. Three, and then gallop.
dried you
That's RM. Did I use RM there? It's M. So weird. On here, it just stays put. Okay, changing that didn't seem to affect it here at all.
Non-stop music for you and your household, even when you leave the app or when you go offline. Listen to
We'll need to see if this looks right in the on the character. Oh well. Yep, it's doing that shit. Turning isn't working, turning in place. maybe further back the rotation. I feel like that would feel right. Unless I can change the... So it's doing that snapping thing. Looks perfect here. It's the part that bugs me is that it actually looks right here. Well, now it doesn't work here, but maybe it will work. Well, no, it's just... Ah, this wasn't checked. There we go. Alright. Just gotta create a montage and use the montage. How did these all get set to no? I guess I didn't mess with them. Yeah, this one's, that's what I was doing. Okay. All these great tools here to work with people's badly made assets. Thank you, Epic. There we go. I need to eat something.
Non-stop music for you and your household, even when you leave the app or when you go offline. Listen to YouTube ad-free.
And I'm back, and you're gonna hear me chew for now, because if I don't keep the mic on, I'll forget to turn it back on. And then where will we be? Where will we be, I ask you? So let's check that out in game, huh? I'm gonna put it on turning too. I wanna see why turning isn't activating yet. No, I didn't do it. Right. Me up here. Asset type, really? It worked on a 2D. Oh, that works correctly here, so I guess it doesn't matter. It's funny. 1D and 2D work differently. Whoa. Uh-oh. I think it's just like that from before. Because I saved as the horse. This doesn't seem to be working. Could modify the strafing one a bit more. Oh yeah, the blocks are actually going to be kept in the... Alright, so I can just rotate these. Can I rotate these, actually? Yeah. See if that works. Doesn't look like it is. Yeah, it's back to 0. curtain, right? Wait, I don't think I actually did those. No, I didn't. I didn't do that correctly at all. None of them. You gotta make sure you hit key, then apply, then save. Do this one here. They could be turned a bit more. Oh, these are... Oh, that's just this. Okay, yeah. Pressing the wrong buttons. Combinations. I could play this in reverse, maybe. For backing up. Like turn right isn't doing it. Turn left is. Oh, yeah, there it is.
Keep your music playing in the background. Take your songs offline.
Still no idea why it's not doing the turn thing. Did I not set? Yeah, I forgot to copy that part. I can't figure this one out. Maybe I missed this. Should work here. Maybe it was the delta seconds thing. No, looks like it's not animating. Wait, is it? Oh, it is. Oh, it's totally working, sort of. Yeah, there we go. It's working on left mouse button, but not right mouse button. What the fuck? What the fuck? It's not doing it either. This isn't either. When I rotate the camera, it plays the animation, but not the character. Oh, wait. Now it's rotating it, I just don't have control of the character for some reason. Oh, what the fuck? Oh yeah, profile camera takes a whole different thing. I remember that. But, I think click just isn't working now. Oh yeah. What's this though? Fundamental conflicts in contemporary game design. Sure, why not? I was gonna show the human condition of game design or something like that by this guy. But this sounds cool too.
So we're actually very lucky to have John Blow. That's the guy who's been sitting up here on stage all this time waiting to get started. We're actually really lucky to have him here. We had him here last year to giving one of the morning keynotes, and it was very inspiring. Everyone really enjoyed his presentation. And we thought we'd have him come back and sort of do a follow-up and inspire us again. And he didn't want to come. He's like, well, geez, you know, to kind of be a good
animation plays when I do left mouse
button. So he had to twist his arm a little bit and say, well, we want you back. You're very inspiring. And John is really someone who I see as kind of the plutonic ideal of an indie game developer.
So weird.
He's not an indie developer because like he couldn't get a job at EA or something. He's an indie developer because that's what he wants to be or wants to do, and realizes that the types of games that he wants to make, he kind of has to be independent and free in that sense. And really, he's been a champion, not only of indie games, but this idea of experimental games. Every year at GDC, he hosts the Experimental Gameplay Workshop, which is inspiring for many folks around the industry. And really, with Chris Hecker and others, started the Indie Game Jam. And that's sort of a model that other developers have been using around the world for experimenting with indie games. And for a long time, I think he was maybe accused of being too idealistic. And it's like, hey, dude, what did you ship? And now, certainly, having put Braid out and the massive success that Braid has received, I think he kind of he seems to have a bit more of a skip in his walk than he used to previously. I think with 93% Metacritic, it's the highest rated. Yeah. It's the highest rated XBLA title for sure, and it's kind of up there with the top 10, at least on Xbox, but certainly an awesome game. And so I don't really know what he's going to be talking about, but I'm going to be taking notes. So everyone, welcome John Blow back for a second year.
Oh, because the controller is rotating.
Well, I didn't quite realize this was supposed to be inspiration, or I wouldn't have had such a glaringly negative title. No. There is inspiration in here to be found for those of us who like to think about difficult problems. My goal here in giving this lecture, and one of the goals that I have as an independent developer, is to try to figure out how to make games that can really touch people, that can change people's lives, or that can actually be genuinely important to them, right? Other media don't have any problem doing this, right? You might meet somebody, a real, ordinary, everyday person, who says, wow, a long time ago I read some book, and it was a really philosophical book, it was really meaningful.
Half-Life.
Or I heard some music that's been an emotional anchor to me, or I saw a film when I was very young, and it's really affected the way that I think for the rest of my life. You won't really hear people say that about video games unless either A, they're very young and impressionable and haven't seen much of the world yet, or B, maybe they're professional game designers and you'll say, oh, such and such game really influenced me. But usually they mean more of a professional, like, game designer.
Okay, it stopped the left mouse button. The right mouse button still isn't working.
This is what my life is about now kind of influence.
Okay, so I think I can add that here.
How do we make things that are important to people, or profound, or meaningful? Well,
oh my
that's
God, the
too
echo.
big of a question for me to answer, either in this lecture or elsewhere. But what I can do is talk about things that we do as a matter of course now that prevent us from meeting those goals, right?
Dear base, just test.
Make something that's deeply meaningful to people. It can't be fake, or at least overtly fake. It can't be unimportant, arbitrary, or careless, right? But as
I have the map open. This is going to take a freaking hour.
Design practices and just ways of making games that are ingrained into our core assumptions now that create things that are fake, unimportant, arbitrary, and careless. And the way to try to solve that is difficult, but
good logic.
So, if we want to make games that are important to people, There are actually two ways to do it, which actually gives us an advantage over other media. We can do it by expression. You know, here I have a picture of some students watching a film. The film is expressing something to them. We can do that in a game with our audio-visual assets and the story and stuff. Another thing that we can do as a game that other media can't quite do is by introducing people to an activity, right? If you teach a young girl to swim and she becomes really good at it or just enjoys it, that might shape the rest of her life, possibly in a highly positive way, right? And you can actually see a reflection of this in two different kinds of games that we have. On the left here, I have story games, right? These are games where there's often gameplay amid, you know, milestones of story, like Metal Gear Solid 4 or Grand Theft Auto 4 and things like that. There are also activity games that aren't based on story, right? Something like Madden, you don't play that for the story, or, you know, Wii Sports or Pac-Man, right? I'm going to be focusing on the kinds of games here on the left, which are a large fraction of what our industry produces. There could be a very, very interesting lecture, a very different lecture about the kinds of games on the right, but I don't have time to talk about those. Wish that I did. So the reason this subject is so interesting to me is developers are always trying to find ways to make better stories, right? Not even dynamic stories, they're certainly working on that, but static storytelling. You know, if you go and play Valve's developer commentary in games like Half-Life 2, you can see all the steps that they took to convey their statically constructed story in the most efficient and impactful way, right? And of course in academia, we have plenty of academics. Where are my slides? They're gone. We have plenty of academics working on dynamic story techniques, right? And you can read lots of papers about those. So here's an example, again, of some of these games that we're all familiar with that use mostly static story in these examples, but we've also seen some games lately, like Fallout 3 and Far Cry 2, that attempt to do some level of dynamic story. What I have to say about all that is I think that story games are inherently conflicted. They have a structural conflict at so deeply ingrained a level that it's impossible to make them strong.
Getting to there.
To make them, I won't say impossible, but it's very, very difficult to make them profound and impactful and deeply meaningful to people. So I don't, you know, we all know that stories and games aren't very good. Oh, why is that? Well, maybe it's just because we don't have good people writing stories and whatever. Maybe that's a little bit true, but I think it's also true because our medium prevents the stories from being good. And a large part of this lecture is going to be devoted to explaining how. So I think that if people sense that a work is conflicted in some deep way, they know that it can't be that meaningful or transcendent or profound, right? It'll be disharmonious and it won't resonate with them. So now, really, what I'm going to talk about in this lecture could be viewed as just one problem, but I'm breaking it down into three subcategories so that I can get more specific and maybe talk about ways of dealing with different subparts of the problem, right? So the first conflict that I'm going to talk about is the meaning of a story versus the dynamical meaning of a game. And to do that, I'm going to have to talk about what exactly I mean by dynamical meaning in the first place. But first, some water. And I'm going to do this by moving away from the AAA games for a minute and talking about art games. There are many different kinds of art games. There are many different schools of thought.
The echo is going to drive me
crazy. The particular one that I'm going to talk about doesn't specifically have a name. These tend to be very small games made by one person or a small group. They tend to be made in a short period of time with a low budget, so they have low production values. And the particular games I'm going to talk about today are interesting in that they communicate themes and ideas through behavior and their core perceptual primitives rather than through story and dialogue and words. And by core perceptual primitives, I mean the sounds that are made or the shapes and colors of objects on the screen. Now, AAA games with $20 million budgets do this kind of thing too.
Strafing seems to be working too. Right, mouse button. Why is it?
When you make a game this small, you get a certain clarity that you can't quite attain in a large game.
Snapping back and forth so quickly here. I need to change that.
So I think I talked about this last year, but a quick recap.
Anyway, this is what I wanted.
This is a game called The Marriage by a guy named Rod.
It's not triggering all the time.
And the point of this game is to communicate what Rod's marriage feels like.
Yeah, it doesn't work
It's a free download on the internet. It's like very small. As you can see, there aren't any big graphical assets to download. When you start up this game, you just see the title of it, The Marriage. It fades out, and there's some dots moving around on the screen and a couple of squares. And the squares maybe catch your attention because they're moving away from each other.
From strafing.
move the mouse over one of the squares and move that toward each other. And so you see, I'm kind of a force of attraction between these two objects. And maybe, since pink is a very stereotypical female color, maybe that represents the wife in the marriage, and maybe the blue square represents the husband, and they'll come together, and then they meet, and then they move apart again. And what is that about? And, you know, when they meet, the pink square gets a little bigger, maybe it's nourished by this interaction, and the blue square gets a little smaller, and what's that? And, you know, so there's some dynamic that's unfolding as you play this game that is speaking to you about this marriage, but not in words. And the process of playing this game, whenever you come up to a new game, you have a process of seeing the first things that the game has to show you, decoding and understanding those principal communications. What's this game like? What do I do in this game? And this game overloads those initial steps with meaning. It loads meaning onto each perceptual primitive so that as you're figuring out how to play the game, you're also understanding the situation being depicted. Another game, so the marriage is a sort of very abstract. It doesn't feel that much like a video game. A lot of people who go to play it might not quite get it and give up very quickly. This game, Gravitation by Jason Rohrer, is much more accessible. When it starts out, you're in a place like the upper left corner there, except you can't really see very much. After walking around for a little bit, you realize that there's this big fireplace here, and there's this kid with a ball, and the ball is being thrown at you by the kid. And if you're in the right place, you can catch it and throw it back. And the music gets a little happier, and the world gets a little brighter as you do that, as you interact with this child. And eventually, you figure out that you can jump really high and even fly. And as you jump up, you can see and go into this maze in the upper right corner.
Here, I stop the character from turning. I can pan the camera around them now.
Like that. And you find these stars, and the higher you go, the more stars there are, but if you're up there too long, maybe your mood will start to sink because you're too far from playing with the child. As you run into these stars, you can sort of collect them, and they'll drop down to the bottom of the screen, depicted in that third image.
Ignore the rotation.
Blocks of ice. And if you push those blocks of ice over into the fire, they'll thaw, and you'll get points. And you discover all this by playing, right? There isn't an instruction book. You discover that you can only push the blocks to the right, but not to the left. You find that
that's good.
the number of points on the block will rapidly
I still feel like it needs to be rotating more from the front.
If you drop several of them and you become really hard to push, then you may get very few points for that, right? And there are these cold objects in your house that are hard to move, and you want to get them in the fire, but you also want to keep playing ball with your kid, and it's hard to do both at the same time, and what does that mean? And you can also run into a situation where you didn't plan things out.
Well, that was weird. The echo was before his voice.
That stands between you and the child, and you can't get there. And now you're screwed because you can't score points, you can't push things out of the way, and you just got to wait for things to melt, and your character gets really depressed. There are a lot of, for the small number of graphical elements and rules to this game, there are a large number of interesting, complex situations that you can enter into, and they're all meaningful. This is a free download from Jason Rohrer's homepage, and if you haven't played it, leave the lecture right now.
Oh. Right and left should be like all the way right and left.
Right. So now Gravitation is a game that's carefully constructed out of behaviors or rules, and each of those rules have a certain meaning. Now, that's cool and all, but a consequence of that in terms of conventional game design is that if you decide to tune the game by adding or changing rules, suddenly you're changing the meaning of this work as a whole, right? So, you know, if before I started tweaking it, this was very clearly a game about inspiration and creativity and manic depression and the balance between family life and work life, right? Maybe I decide this just isn't quite going to hook people. I want the player to feel like he has more agency. I want him to feel like he can score a little more and have a little more power. So I'm going to add a one-time use power-up that's like bullet time, right? It'll like freeze time or maybe slow it down tremendously, and I get super strength, and I can push 2 or 3 blocks into the fire all at once. And that could be very interesting, right? I might want to plan out when I use that. But whereas, in my opinion, you know, if I'm some designer, I might think that makes the game more fun. I now have the problem that it makes the game less meaningful, right? Because what does that freeze mean? I invented it as a sort of game kind of operation for game design purposes, right? It didn't come from the initial idea of describing the interaction of a family with, you know, a working father. So
I'm just thinking right now about various ways to handle this animation thing. I guess I'll just do what I was thinking.
Introduce an idea that's going to be misinterpreted, right? That can happen. So if I list out, here's a table where I'm listing out on the left you know, with a lot of dots because I didn't want to type them all, but there's a bunch of rules making up this game, like the stars become blocks of ice, and the blocks could prevent you from reaching the child. And on the right, there's some interpretations that the player might form, and I don't know exactly what those are, but as the author, I can guess.
I knew that was going to happen.
So, you know, maybe I'm thinking that the stars are ideas, and as I bring them down into my house, they become concrete projects that I'm working on, right? But maybe in the third line there, when I designed this game, there was a bug that I didn't really observe, so I didn't fix it. That happens all the time, right? And I didn't see it, but maybe under some circumstances, a variable like flips over into a negative number, and the kid turns to the left away from me and stops throwing the ball, but just stands there. I don't know that wasn't intentional necessarily, so I'm going to form an interpretation of that bug and kind of try to fit it into the rest of that story formed by the rest of the rules of the game. That is plausible as long as most of the game has a strong structure, and it seems reasonable to me that this bug fits in with the rest of the meaning of the game. But as I add more and more rules to this, it becomes less and less like a meaningful crystal of a game and more like an arbitrary mishmash. Right? Now, another interesting thing about games, because they're code, all programmers understand this, but it should be understandable by anyone. By adding and removing elements from a game, you can turn any game into any other game, right? If I wanted to make gravitation more like Pac-Man, I could add some dots on the floor that you pick up for score, right? 1 point per dot, and then maybe I'll take away the gravity, right? And so you can just walk around, and the sky is not the sky anymore; it's like the ground, you know. And the first time I do that, maybe there's just dots, but the rest of the game is still gravitation. The player might have some interpretation like, oh, you're cleaning up the house instead of playing with the kid, like the dots are trash or something, and I don't know why that's thematically important on the same level as the other stuff, but I'll take the author's word for it, right? But as you get more and more toward Pac-Man, the original meaning about the family interactions becomes less and less plausible, like as you add ghosts and power pills and stuff. But the point that I want to make with this chart is that you always have an interpretation, a potential interpretation for any behavior, any rule that you add to a game. And even if I delete all the gravitation rules and add all the Pac-Man rules, I have a game that's exactly Pac-Man, but that has an interpretation. And the thing is that in the games industry, we're just used to not paying attention to that interpretation, but it's there, right? Some people make jokes about it, like, oh, Pac-Man's a joke about drugs or something, because you eat the power pills and go on a rampage. That's kind of a plausible interpretation of Pac-Man, sort of, right? And that's what I want to talk about.
Okay, there it is.
So for any game, right, any system comprised of behaviors, which I'll call a dynamical system, that system communicates something to the player, right? Whether you, as the author of the game, intended to communicate that thing or not.
I can't
and you're not
run
even
backwards, so I only need
because the interpretation's subjective, right? This is just like any form of art, right? I'm just restating this for games, but I'm saying that the gameplay does this, right? It's not necessarily just the story or the visual assets, okay? And this is what I'm calling the dynamical meaning. The dynamical meaning is whatever the coagulation of all these things in the right-hand interpretation column, if you put all those together,
I feel like that already is just that one backwards.
The dynamical meaning is what you get.
Reverse.
So if any of you have read Ian Bogo's stuff, he has this idea called procedural rhetoric, where you say things through gameplay. What I'm calling dynamical meaning is like that, but more vague and more fuzzy, because it doesn't have to be rhetorical, it doesn't have to be intentional, and it doesn't even have to be procedural. I think that procedures are an implementation detail, and what we really care about is behavior of a game system, which
its head's further back.
Codify in rules by writing
twisted around a bit.
It's not necessary. Behavior can just exist.
I can just reverse these.
So what I want to hammer home and beat like a dead horse.
What if I can just put them on here in reverse?
Conveys thematic elements to the audience, but it does not tell a story. Which brings me to that first conflict. I've just got done saying that every game has this dynamical meaning that arises from the rules of gameplay. And games that have story also have semantics of the story, right? The plot and characters and all that stuff, the mood that is trying to be imposed by this authored story. Whether it's pre-baked, right, pre-authored, or dynamic, that is happening, right? And conflict number one is that when we make games, designers are not used to thinking about this dynamical meaning, right? They kind of ignore it, and their main concern in this kind of situation is making a catchy story that players are going to think is cool, with compelling characters maybe, and they care about the gameplay too, but they want the gameplay to be fun, right? And I put fun in quotes because nobody actually knows what that means. Sometimes people pretend they do, but they don't. And but we need to use that word, like it's a matter of day-to-day existence in the game industry, right? We all know what fun is, even though we don't know what it is. So the point, though, is that the story and these fun game mechanics have separate meanings. Those meanings will often clash unless we work very, very hard to make them coexist. So this is a problem that we have barely noticed, right, as an industry yet, but it happens all it happens all the time, right, because we're not paying attention, and it's a problem that other media that are mature do not have, right? If you're a director of a film, and a large part about the film, is focused on some character that you want the audience to empathize with, and then at some point that character dies, and there's a funeral where other characters in the film who cared a lot about the dead character now are paying their respects, and it's a very sad kind of scene. Then when you go and you have the musician, score that scene, you don't want him to play happy carnival music, right? Because it'll destroy the mood that you're trying to set with his funeral, this somber, touching mood, right? Unless you're David Lynch or something, you might do that on purpose to unsettle the audience and make them confused, right? Or make them feel very strange. But normally we don't want to do that, right? We only want to do it if we really mean to do it. In the games industry, we do that. We have
can't do a negative
music
here.
over every funeral all the time, and we're like deaf, and we have no idea what we're doing. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to get less abstract and more concrete and talk about how this manifests in a couple of popular games. The first one is BioShock, and again, I talked about exactly this problem last year, so I'm going to skim it really fast, but there are these little girls called the Little Sisters in the game who have been kind of manipulated in very unhumane ways by a corporation, but as a result of that, they have a resource that's very valuable to you because you're living in this rough world and you need to survive and get stronger, and this resource will help you get stronger. And the story, right, the voice acting and the animation and all that of BioShock presents to you this supposed dilemma that you need to kind of kill the Little Sisters, or at least some of them, and take away this resource that you can be strong and survive, but at the same time, you want to care about them because they're just little girls who don't deserve to be mistreated. And so you have this decision: do I be altruistic and take care of them and save their lives, or do I do what I need to do to make it through the game and survive, right? So the game is trying to say that, but at the same time, the designers of the game felt it was important for the game to be balanced, right? And for the player to be able to survive through the game regardless of what choices he makes, right? So they built in some game rules such that no matter what you do to the Little Sisters, you'll always get about the same amount of the resource with a very small token difference. And game players notice this very quickly, and it feels weird, it feels wrong, right? Because on the one hand, the author of the story says, these Little Sisters are very important and you should care about them. And on the other hand, the author of the game design says, well, you can pretty much do what you want. It doesn't matter either way. Just go for it, man. So that might work, that might work well enough to do like a marketing campaign or something like, oh, there's a big ethical dilemma, but, is that going to stand up 20 years from now or 40 years from now as like a great, touching, profound moment in video games? I don't think that it will. If it does, then hopefully I'm not in video games at that point.
That almost looked like a strafing.
A different one, right?
Sidestepping animation.
Has all these
Actually,
that you can go on
almost
dates
accidentally
with
made one.
when you're tired of going on shoot-'em-up missions.
Sidestepping.
You can actually go on dates with the guys too, but it's totally not gay. It's like cool and stuff.
Let's try it.
And most of these girls have, you can
How do I
progress the
limit
relationship by going on several dates, and
forward and
you'll
back
eventually
speeds,
have some gameplay effect as a result of building that relationship, right? One girl might help heal you if you're in a troubled spot, right? Another one can call the DA and get the police to stop chasing you. All except for this one girl, Kate, who doesn't do anything. But you expect her to at some point. So you take her out on dates, 3, 4, 5. These things take a long time. You've got to go to the bowling alley and like do something and go play pool. And it gets tedious. And you're like, Kate, like do something besides just say some canned piece of dialogue. But nothing. She'll never do anything interesting until at some point late in the story, spoiler alert, right? Not that the story, yeah, whatever. So there's this wedding where your cousin and some other girl are getting married, and your main character, who you've been playing and are supposed to be identifying with for the whole game, is talking to him and he's like, yeah, there's this girl Kate who I really like, who I want to invite to the wedding. And as a player, you're just like, no. Kate is the most, the game designer taught me, expressed to me, that Kate is the most boring character in this game, who I have no reason to be with. And yet the person authoring the story decided that exactly the opposite was true, and that a pivotal moment at the end of the game was going to revolve around whether Kate lives or dies, right? So two people are trying to teach you two very different things, and they didn't notice, or they didn't quite understand. Maybe they made Kate non-functional on purpose so that you wouldn't use her, but you know, that just means that she's irrelevant, right? That she has no semantic meaning in terms of that dynamical meaning that I was talking about.
Dynamical.
So that's a clear conflict.
Dynamical.
I was going to do one from Half-Life 2, but I cut it for time reasons. If you do questions and anybody cares, we can talk about that. There are a lot of conflicts in a lot of games. Like I said, this is a widespread problem in the things that we make. I don't mean to pick on these particular games, except that I intentionally chose 3 games that are very highly rated and very financially successful, because I don't want to pretend like the problems I'm talking about are somehow preventing these games from being blockbusters, right? That's not at all true. But what is true, I think, is that these kinds of problems are preventing them from being coherent artistic works, right? From being meaningful, at least to me, and hopefully to a lot of people, right? Okay, so what I've said is there's this conflict between story and the dynamical meaning. How do you resolve it? Well, you might cut the story from the game, you might cut the dynamical meaning from the game, or you might make the two work together, right? Those seem to be the exhaustive list of what to do. So part A, don't use the story. What does that mean? Well, maybe you're building something like that game Gravitation or like The Marriage, but does that confine you to really small art games, or is there a way to scale that up, until you're doing that kind of expression through, you know, core gameplay elements and core AV elements at a $10 million scale or a AAA game scale that people are going to buy instead of GTA 4? I have no idea how to do that, right? Hopefully, maybe somebody will think about that, or maybe we'll eventually, sometime in the future, come to a time when people play 10-minute games or 20-minute games and feel fulfilled because of that, or 1-hour games or 2-hour games. I don't exactly know. But if we wanted to start to think in that direction, how do we do that? Well, what does a story do for people, right? And can we do the things that a story does in a way that does not involve story, right? Well, a story gives you interesting mental stuff, right? You want to know what happens next. You want to know what happens in the characters to the story. You want to know what they think about each other or what they're going to do to the environment or each other, right? Because we're kind of hardwired to think people are interesting. And a story also helps establish like lower level themes and moods that help just supply interest, right? So can we supply that kind of interesting mental stuff without a story? I don't know. I would like some people to work on that. I would like to work on it myself. And I'm not sure that that's the direction the industry is going to go, though, because you know, I described Gravitation as like a little gem that's hard to construct. If you're going to scale that up and up and up, you're talking about something colossally difficult to construct just to get that same mental interest that you can get from putting a story in, right? But any dumbass can write a story for a game, and as you have seen from playing our games, a lot of dumbasses do. So, you know,
holy shit.
If an industry as a whole, like individuals can take a hard problem and work on it and do something awesome, right? But whenever you look at an industry as a whole and a bunch of people who just want to make money, the trend is going to be toward the easier thing that has the biggest payoff, right? And that's where it's going to go, is story in games. Like, so I'm not pretending that we can make large-scale games without story. I'm just saying I wish we would. The other option is not to have your game have a dynamical meaning. Well, I said that that's impossible, but what you can do is maybe make sure that there's no parts of the kind of fuzz out the dynamical meaning until it's in the background, like it has magnitude 0 and doesn't interfere with your story. Then you could maybe have a strong story, except for the points I'm going to get to later in the lecture. That could be possible, but that kind of devolves to KC, managing the dynamic meaning, which we'll talk about in a minute, because it always exists. It's just getting it down to 0 is like manipulating that meaning vector in a very specific way.
I mean, slow walk and fast walk don't work.
If you say, I'm going to cut all the dynamical meaning out of my game, then you're essentially giving up on the idea that that gameplay can have meaning that was profound, right? Profound and meaningful was a target I set at the beginning of this lecture. If you say, I'm going to make it unnoticeable and like magnitude 0, then that's meaningless, right? That's the opposite of where we're trying to go. The story might be meaningful and profound, but then why is it in a game, right? Why didn't you just go make a film, right? Or write a novel or something? So the third option, which is kind of what we have to do, is tight coupling, which is what Ian Bogos called it, which is when you just work really hard to make the story and the dynamical meaning cohere and not openly conflict with each other, right? And the problem is that's kind of like pressing bubbles out of wallpaper, right? You press one down and another one pops up over here because you end up changing aspects of the story that don't fit the gameplay and changing aspects of the gameplay that don't fit the story. And this is really hard because A, we don't have a culture of designers paying attention to dynamical meaning, like I was saying, but B, the AAA production model makes this very, very difficult because you often can't really tell what gameplay is going to be like until very late in a project, and it's often too late to make large changes at that point, and good luck convincing a team to make huge sweeping changes for some little, hey, you know, this dude said there's a conflict between the gameplay and the story, you know, we have to change everything. Like, you know, if you made a game, and at the outset, you wanted the game to be thematically about how technology alienates humans from one another or something, right? And then at some point, you know, you go on vacation as a lead designer and you come back or you go on another project for a while, you come back very late in the game, and somebody has put a robotic sidekick into the game that's cute and tells jokes, you know, and that follows the main character around everywhere. And you're like, it's a robotic sidekick, it can't be humanistic and funny because that goes against the theme of the alienation of technology. We have to cut that and like replace it with like a sidekick dog, right, or something. But then it's like, oh, we have all these characters. We already wrote dialogue about how they make jokes about the robot and tell him he needs to like oil his brain or something. And that would make sense saying that to a dog, and we already recorded those in voice acting, right? And that's going to suck. And we designed all these levels that use the robot's tractor beam, and it doesn't make sense for a dog to have a tractor beam. Like, so what? Maybe he's a telekinetic dog? Like, I don't know. You end up, if you take this seriously, it's a tremendous amount of work that, quite honestly, nobody's ever going to do because it's not affordable, right? It's not feasible financially, or in terms of reasonably spending the lives of the 100 people you have working on your game for 3 years, right? But if that's true, that's kind of a drag, because does that mean that we're kind of doomed to make these works that don't stand up for themselves? I don't know. So that one, story and gameplay conflicting, is one problem that I think runs very deep, and as I said, it's very hard to solve, but in theory, it is solvable, right? Given an infinite amount of resources, you know, manpower and time and all that stuff, you could come up with a very large-scale game that is perfect in that sense, and you could do it repeatedly forever, right? But the next things I'm going to talk about don't even make that possible. Like, so, yeah, I'll just start talking and you'll get what I'm saying. So the second conflict I'm going to talk about is called challenge versus progression. The progression comes from story, usually. It can come from other things too. But here I'm going to focus on story, right? For a story to be interesting and compelling, it has to occur. Time has to move in the space of the story as you go through the game. You need to go from scene to scene to scene, right? But we also don't know how to make games that don't have challenge in them, right? There may be other ways to get people interested in playing a game, but right now we do it by a challenge. Why challenge? There's a lot of people who will try to explain that to you, like maybe you know, as we evolved, we kind of worked in this instinct for play in order to help us be more suited to real-world circumstances.
Oh, because this is constantly firing.
That could be true, but there's a more fundamental reason, I think,
so
that
Anita is running thing
as much
here.
Supposition, and that's just that if there's a challenge in the game,
yeah, there we go. And then this needs an is moving backwards thing.
Your interaction with the game is meaningful, that it's important, right? If I'm being shot at by guys and I don't duck behind cover or whatever, or I suck at aiming, it's very obvious that bad things are going to happen to me, right? So it's very clear that if I don't do the right things, there are consequences. And that's just a fundamental thing about game design that we do by reflex. And And we kind of ignore that basic fact of clarity of consequences, but it's very important. Now the problem is that for story to occur, it has to keep proceeding to the right, which
I'm gonna have to make this work for multiplayer at some
point. And the
point
problem
too.
is that challenge is more like a friction force, right? Challenge is about preventing you from continuing in the game unless you meet some bar of performance, right? And story and challenge work against each other. No matter how hard you work on a game, well, no matter how hard you work on a game, if you've got a story in the traditional way, and you've got challenge elements in the traditional way that we use them, it's structurally unsound. It won't stand. Like, they work against each other. To put it a slightly different way, we often give story out as a reward, right? Like, hey, you got through this certain part, and we'll give you the next cutscene, right? And then, but challenge is about withholding that reward until you deserve it, right? So the story, when left by itself, would just go till the end, but the challenge is saying, no, the story can't go. And that's a problem. We've noticed that this is a problem over the past little while in the games industry. And we've come up with one solution that a lot of games seem to try to implement, which is to replace real challenge with faux challenge, right? So taking this big arrow, which represented a lot of friction force from challenge, represented it, or replaced it with a very small arrow, and then a big dotted, like, we're pretending that the big arrow is still there, right? And what these games do is try to seem like there's still a challenge, but actually make it very easy, right? It's the dramatic presentation of non-difficult things as difficult. This is what games like God of War and Fable 2 do. Like, there'll be a lot of enemies that run up and surround you, and it's a big battle scene, but really you just like hit the button a couple times and a lot of them die, right? So you feel like you're fighting, but you're not really fighting. It's like pretend fighting. Another way that this is done is dynamic difficulty adjustment, right? Where instead of requiring the player to increase their performance to meet some bar of difficulty, right? You lower the difficulty bar until the player can walk over it. Now, an interesting thing to note about this is that we can't actually use DDA or the dramatic presentation of difficulty. We can't actually use that to shrink this blue arrow all the way down to 0. Because for this big dotted, like, empty balloon of portrayed difficulty to exist, it has to have something inside, right? And if we take away all of the challenge, then people will see that, right? And they'll lose the sort of suspension of disbelief in the game. I would maybe more call it suspension of value system. So we all know when you read a work of fiction, you know that the characters in the book are not real, right? But you choose to invest in them as though they were real for a little while so that you can be enthralled by the story, right? So that you can care about what's going to happen next to them, right? There's a similar thing that happens in games. Like I said, challenge makes you feel like it's important what you do. You know when you sit down and play a game, it doesn't really matter that much what score you get or whether you make it to the end or something in the context of your external everyday life. However, we willingly put that aside and pretend like this game is really important for the duration that we play it. But that's only possible so long as the game is also complicit in that pretense that it's important. And if we let this arrow fall to 0, we lose our main method of keeping that pretense up. And the last thing I have to say about faux challenge, remember that list at the beginning of this lecture of ways not to be profound, right? Being fake was at the top of the list. So you may be able to be entertaining, right? You may be able to give somebody a power fantasy or make them feel strong or feel cool, but I don't think you're going to change somebody's life through faux challenge, right? It's not going to be that deep. People will feel that it's a surface thing. And lastly, I feel that challenge is actually very precious and that we misuse it. Challenge is one thing that games as a medium can do much more directly and much more extensively than any other medium, right? A film or a novel can be challenging, or music especially, I guess. We have the most examples of challenging music. In that, you need to have a lot of education to understand it, or you need to invest a lot in trying to be there with it, right? But in games, we can directly feed challenge to the player and have them respond instantly all the time, right? So challenge is kind of our domain, and we ought to acknowledge that and understand that and treat it as precious, because if we're going to have a place in the world of art alongside other media, we have to play to our strengths and use them effectively. And we're not doing that right now. We're wasting it, and it's kind of a shame. Now, I've used the word challenge a lot, And that may make you think that I'm calling for, oh, games must all be very difficult and frustrating to the player and stuff. I don't think that's true. A game doesn't need to be difficult, right? It just needs to be interesting. It needs to convince the player that their actions matter. And challenge is one way that we know how to do that because we've fallen back on that time and time again over the decades.
I just want a different...
But I think there are other ways that we're only just starting to explore. Instead of presenting things as like a violent, you better live up to this kind of challenge, or a hard, are you smart enough to figure out this puzzle kind of challenge, you can have things that are more like...
Actually, I guess if running, no matter what, you want this to happen.
Requests that the players step up to a certain level of performance, for which there is a consummate reward if they choose to meet that level of performance, right? Maybe it's not even performance. Maybe it's, hey, I'm giving you this opportunity to expand your aesthetic notions of what is beautiful, right, or what is interesting.
Running to the left.
Games can work in that space, and I could give a whole hour lecture about that, and I kind of did at the GDC
it's
this
if
year,
you're strafing.
but it's not available
That's
online.
the question.
I'll put it up when I put this one up. So, third conflict, interactivity versus pre-baked delivery. And kind of dynamic stories too, although that's not in the titles. So, if we're using a story and we're trying to be meaningful to people, often we're trying to create drama or some kind of, crafted moments that land, on the audience or are received by them in a way that we have crafted carefully. This requires a lot of technique, right? Pacing and framing and setting things up. It requires delivery, as they call it, in the stand-up comedy field, for example. You could have a comic stand in front of an audience and tell a bunch of jokes, and nobody will think they are funny, right? And then you could bring in another comic, next door, fresh audience, hopefully, and say exactly the same jokes, exactly the same words, but he will deliver them differently and more skillfully, and everybody will be just rolling, right? Same jokes. Well, what's the difference? Well, one guy just understands delivery. He understands how to set things up and pace them and frame them. And games don't let us do that because they're interactive, and interactivity directly sabotages this minute-to-minute delivery, which is the way that effective stories are told, right? This kind of technique doesn't just come into play in stand-up comedy, right? There are poetics that occur even in just written prose. There are sequences of ideas that are placed careful distances of each other. If I write this sentence,
so I need to reset
I know that you read this sentence recently, or
thing.
if I use this word, I'm going to use the synonym over here instead of the same word again. The context is used all the time, right? In games,
stopping me
you
from
don't know
running.
where the player just came from, right? You don't know if he's holding a gun in his hand or some flowers, you don't know if he's wearing like pants or what.
I think I'm moving backwards.
As a designer, we could try to approach that problem
Some strafing,
and pre-author a bunch of content or think in
backwards.
advance about everything the player might do. But as we know, this invites a combinatorial explosion that we just can't deal with, right? You cannot think about all these things in advance. You cannot pre-bake that content. My favorite illustration of this is shown in these pictures here. It's a walkthrough of the game Deus Ex from the comedy site Old Man Murray, where their instructions to the player for the walkthrough, in the beginning of the game, you go through this military base and you get all your instructions, and they said, hey, pick up that big American flag in the lobby and just stick it in front of everybody that you're about to talk to, right? And it makes every situation completely ridiculous, because you're talking to this guy and he's like, oh, Agent Denton, we need you to infiltrate the Statue of Liberty and kill all the terrorists, and you're going to need these weapons to do it. And he's like super serious and stuff. There's this American flag that you're like waving into space, and there was no way for the designers to anticipate that, right? This happens with everything in every game that we make, right? I just like this because it's an extremely prominent reminder of that. But there's also a deeper structural problem, right? So that's a surface problem, delivery, right? Interactivity also sabotages story at a deeper level, which you can illustrate with the classic idea of Chekhov's gun, right? Anton Chekhov said, if you say in the first chapter that there's a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter it absolutely must go off, right? If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there.
Less than 0.
So what does this do in linear media stories, right? The main thing, the main point that Chekhov was trying to
now I need if I'm running
is that it provides an economy of audience attention, right? If you just want to put cool stuff on stage and I wanted this place to feel a little old west.
Just moving backwards, that's fine.
some people in the audience are going to be wondering, like, what's the deal with that gun? You know, they're going to be thinking about it. Whose gun is that? Who's going to use it? Because people like to think about
not
people,
running.
right?
Do this.
And then the play goes on, and nobody shoots anybody, and it's like, wow, that kind of pulled the audience's attention away from the things that the playwright was actually, and the director were actually trying to have them focus their attention on, the specific relationships and specific things that happen, right? So this is a way of ensuring that you optimally use the elements in your play to focus the attention where you want it, right? That's one fundamental technique of telling good stories. As a side effect, a lot of other good things happen as a result of Chekhov's gun, right? The gun provides foreshadowing because you are going to be thinking about it now, because that gun was put on that mantelpiece intentionally. So you're thinking, wow, who's going to use that? And who, right now in this scene, when they're having this very mild but may lead to a bigger argument later,
Startled
who's thinking
maquette.
about that gun in terms of the characters in the play, right? It also provides justification. If you have two characters at the end of the play and they both have been hanging out and there was no gun and they're just arguing, and all of a sudden one of them pulls a gun out of his pocket and goes bam and shoots the other guy, it's like, that's kind of a deus ex machina. It's like, where the hell did that come from, right? I had no idea as the viewer of this play that the stakes of this argument involved somebody getting shot. And again, you might do that intentionally.
I wonder if it should be rotated the other way.
Right? Furthermore, so having a gun on the mantle provides that justification. Furthermore, in a good, well-told story, it is not an out-of-context gun like floating in the Matrix, right? It's like, it's got context, right? Why is there a gun on the wall? Well, it belongs to a hunter or an ex-military officer, right? Well, why is it being displayed? Well, either he keeps it ready to be used at a moment's notice, or maybe he's proud of, you know, having done something with it 10 years ago. But that's going to affect what one of the prominent characters in the play is who he is in the minds of the audience and the other people in the play. It's going to affect the setting. It's going to affect what the
Although now the
characters think about
strafing
each
one's
other
not
and
as
the
good.
mood that they
No,
have
that's not
occupying
good.
this
That's
place.
not right.
One decision like that affects everything in a well-told story, right? So Chekhov's gun and other techniques, which I'm not going to talk about because of time, requires an intense pre-process in order to generate a well-told story, right? So story is, in essence, a filtered presentation of events that have already happened, at least in the mind of the author, if not in the mind of the audience. Now, we can have dynamic stories, right? That's one thing that a lot of people propose to try to deal with pre-baked content kind of problems. We can't anticipate everything the player's going to do, but we can have a story.
Maybe you should be looking over the right shoulder instead.
Give them the feeling of being in a world where
Let's
they have
still
more
turn to
agency,
this way.
right? One thing that people say is if we just have AI that's good enough to do that, we'll be fine. I don't believe that, because a drama manager, which should be apparent if you just look at Chekhov's gun for a bit, all those subtle changes that you make to make the story good require human-level AI, right? You have to solve.
Yeah, I feel like it should be the other animation, but turn this. Let me just see how the strafing thing looks.
For 50 years. So
if I'm giving anything up. Oh, that does look like a nice little sideways strafe
if
thing.
it happens, we'll have a lot more
But
to
tilt
worry
turn
about
too
than
much.
just if our drama manager is good or not, right? We'll have much bigger ethical issues to think about in the world. So I'm kind of going to put that to the side. If that happens, this lecture is out of date. But even if you had a human quality drama manager, or if you had an actual human in the loop of your game making up the events, like you have in ARGs or something sometimes, right? That human can never even match the quality that you can get by having a human author a pre-baked story, right? Because he can't do Chekhov's gun properly. He can't do any of these structural storytelling techniques properly. He just has to dynamically adjust and do the best thing that he can do as time goes on, which is a subset, and probably a weak subset, of all the stories that you can tell if you can just tell any story. If you don't believe this, I want to bring up one analogy that may be clear to people who do programming or who do character animation. It's well understood in the world of animation that movies are always going to have better, more impactful, better-looking animation than games will, right? And the reason is because movie animation is done in a pre-process. If you have some guy walking through a desert and he steps on a rock and his leg kind of twists funny, which happens all the time in animation tools, right? If you're making a movie, you're like, oh, cut that, rewind a few seconds, let's have him put his foot down in a slightly different place. Or if that looks awkward, if he doesn't look cool walking like that, let's just cut the rock out of the scene, right? Put it somewhere else, make that piece of ground flat. You can't do that in a game, right? But in a game, if that rock's there and you saw it there and the guy comes over to step on it, his leg's going to do what it's going to do, right? And you can't filter that in a way that will enforce your story in the way that you can in a film, right? So think about that conundrum there and just apply that to dynamic story versus static story. It's exactly the same issue. So to recap, here are the storytelling techniques we inherently suck at. Foreshadowing, justification, pacing, poetic and tonal adjustment of words for the context of previous words, which is part of that delivery stuff. Because we're so audio-visual in games, vocal emphasis and body language is not just, pre-baked stuff like that would be tuned by dynamic story as well. But the last thing, which is maybe the most important, is importance, right? If a story is just made up by an AI drama manager, I just don't think that it can be as important as something that some person sweated over, for 2 years, like squeezing blood out of a stone, trying to explain to you this thing that meant something deep to him, right? It's a different class of story. It's just not going to be as important to me. And if it's a static story, right, if it's pre-baked, it can't be that important because we shoved all this gameplay in the middle that interferes with it, right? If it was that important of a story, if it was that compelling for me to tell you this, then I would have told you that in a linear medium where the gameplay doesn't detract from it. Okay, so if I can be any more abrasive, dynamic stories are pretend stories. They're poorly structured, poorly delivered. Whether they are pre-baked or dynamic, game stories will always be awkward second fiddle to the stories told by linear media. They will always do it better than we do because we are interactive. Now, at the beginning of the talk, I showed a few of those games where the story is kind of part of the core value proposition, right? Like in Metal Gear Solid 4 especially, like the gameplay is kind of something that you buy the game for, but the big story, like what's Solid Snake going to do and what's going to happen to him is a big reason why a lot of people buy that. If that is our core value proposition going into the future with our biggest money games, then our core value proposition kind of sucks, right? And it'll make us money, but it won't let us touch people authentically and deeply, right? Because we're not being authentic and deep. We're not allowing ourselves to do it. So I'm back to what I said originally, like I've come out all anti-story here, and I personally would like to find an effective way to not use story in bigger games or in more compelling games. And I don't know how you scale up gravitation to the size of something like Metal Gear Solid 4, but I'm interested to try. And I welcome anybody out there who likes hard problems to try too. Another solution to this problem is to just take a very different approach to story, right? So Steve Gaynor, one of the designers for BioShock 2, said this on his blog: video games are not a traditional storytelling medium per se. The player is an agent of chaos, making the medium ill-equipped to convey a pre-authored narrative with anywhere near the effectiveness of books or film. Rather, a video game is a box of possibilities, and the best stories told are those that arise from the player expressing his own agency within a functional, believable game world. So in the worldview that Steve is expressing here, it's not so much when you make a game that you're going to try to present a story to the player, you're rather giving them something with which they can create a story either for themselves or their friends, right? And this is a way, Will Wright has given lectures before where he talks about this is one of the things that people find valuable about The Sims, right? They like to tell stories to other people and make presentations about what happened to their Sims. I don't know exactly where that worldview fits in terms of attempting profundity or attempting deep meaning, but maybe there's somewhere to go there. The last thing, I asked this question before, what does story provide and can we provide it in a different way? Usually when we think about this, we focus on linear media that have stories, that have plots, right? All of the conflicts that I was talking about before come from, or at least gain their large magnitude, from the fact that they're about sequences of events over time, right? And interactivity doesn't let you predict sequences of events over time. There are many other forms of art that plenty of people would say are plenty profound and plenty deep and that they were deeply moved by, like music and sculpture and painting and all kinds of things, right? That we as designers do not very often look to for reference. And we sure could, right? I think that we're a little too much steeped in the movie culture, right? Mainly the movie culture, sometimes the book culture. We could do well to get far, far away from that in the future. And I think that these art games are a good first step at trying to move away from that. I don't know how far we can go in that direction. I'd like to see us experiment a lot. But if this kind of experimentation is going to happen, which sort of brings me to my last point, we art game authors need to abandon the message model of meaning, right? The way that I described both of these games, they were very carefully crafted in terms of each gameplay rule meaning a specific thing. And that can be very interesting, but it can also be taken too far. And I think it already has been taken too far in terms of some of the less skillful art games that have been produced lately, right? I think if you're trying to be deep or meaningful, the message model of meaning is an insufficient way to make games, right? And what is that? Well, you know, we all know there are little fables for kids and stuff that have some short, easy to understand story, and it ends like, hey, the moral of the story is people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, right? And you're saying something to somebody, perhaps in a condescending way, like, hey, I'm smarter than you, and I'm telling you something that you should live by. That's kind of insulting, right? A little bit. Like, if you can't talk to a peer that way. You talk to a child that way. And a lot of gamers get mad at the idea of our art games, partly because they think we're trying to take away their fun, but partly because I think they do anticipate being condescended to. And sometimes they're right? Sometimes we would do well to actively try to avoid that model of condescension when creating something for an audience. The other problem with the message model of meaning is that it trivializes meaning, right? Like in high school, in America at least, I was taught to read notable books and then write these 5-paragraph essays that explain very redundantly and very boringly what the book is about, which is bullshit. Like, you can't, if you could say what the book was about in the 5-paragraph essay form, then the author of the book would have just written a 5-paragraph essay explaining to you the thing. He wouldn't have written a 300-page book, right? But he felt the need to write that book, and why are you trying to, I don't know, never mind. But, So that sucks. And my friend Frank Lance explained it very well and very poetically when he said we should be aiming for meaning which is less specific, less concrete and deliberate, harder to define, harder to pin down, a meaning that transcends the author-reader conduit model of message-style meaning, a meaning that absorbs intention but is not bound by it, a meaning that can't be reduced to a claim about the world but is no less about the world because of it. All right? If we can do that, I think we'll be okay. So I think when somebody sits down and tries to make one of these games with a message model in mind, he's deluding himself at least a little bit, because the true meaning of a game, that aggregation of those right-hand-side columns of interpretations of all those game rules, is always going to be much more complex than whatever you set out to build, right? Not just because the player will have his own interpretation, but because very quickly the combinatorics go through the roof, and you can't predict what people are going to see and what they're going to do, right? I'm okay with that. My attitude in making games is, you know, much like I was saying about the 5-paragraph essay, if I can put all this meaning into a little box and wrap it up with a bow and hand it to you and say, here you go, here's my message for you. You can fully understand this just by opening the box and looking in. It can't be that important, right? Because I'm just some guy. Like, if I understand something, it's not going to be profound, right? It's not going to be something deep about the world or about things beyond the world, right? So my model for what I try to do, rather than taking a message and putting it in a box, is maybe try to find something I don't fully understand, right? That's worth communicating to somebody, right? Like, I don't quite understand this thing over here, but it seems very important to me. And I can point at it, like, it's over there. Like, can you see it? And not everybody will be able to see what I'm pointing at, right? But some people will. Some people will see it, and they'll see maybe more of it than I do, or different parts of it than I do. And in their play experience, they'll build up a different perspective on this thing that I'm pointing at than I had. But they'll be kind of seeing the same thing, and we will have this kind of communication that is very rare and very precious, and I think is one of the things that we can aim for, or should be aiming for, if we want our medium to be anything but, you know, trivial enjoyment. So I just said that if I can say things, if I can make concrete statements, they're not, they can't be that important.
I just said
right?
that.
And I just spent most of this lecture making statements about story.
You did.
So I would like to end it with a question about something that I don't completely understand. but that I would just like to offer, right? Early in the talk, I said that, you know, all these rules in games like Passage are very meaningful, and if you just want to be a game designer, like, and add this kind of gamer rule that makes the gameplay more cool, but that disregards the meaning, then you maybe damage the meaning of the work, or make it more muddled, right? Maybe, but maybe not, right? What if you designed a game that was very clearly meaningful, right? It had a sound, solid structure, it didn't have any conflicting elements, and then you inserted a gamer trope, like we're all familiar with, like invulnerability, or, you know, super strength, or bullet time, that clearly had no place in that, right? Could you use that as a lens to observe all of the things that do belong in that structure of meaning, right? Could you use it to use
because walk
our
left should be that.
medium to investigate these themes, say, of family and relationships between work and home, in a different way, in a way that people would never expect it, right?
I'm seeing something else.
Because if I make a game like this, and every rule that I ever express comes from this one solid picture that I have, that I'm trying to communicate to you, then I could do something very touching and personal, right? And that's valuable. And that's one model of art.
Maybe it
right?
is working.
But one other thing that I can do is, you know, try to introduce some kind of external perspective, some way to use the game as a medium to step outside.
Not perfect, but looks like it kind
of my internal mental structure of what family life is about,
just for
and escape it, right?
This.
And I haven't explained that very well, but
I actually
I'm going to leave
think.
it at that. Thanks very much. If we have any more time, we can take questions.
I know you mentioned that if we came back to this, that if anyone wanted to know what had happened with Half-Life 2 that you were very critiqued, and was that that you go back and actually cover what you saw as the flaws?
Yeah, well, there are many flaws in all those games, right? But the one that I was going to talk about in Half-Life 2 is there's a fundamental tension, again, between the story and characterization and the structure of being a first-person shooter, right? So Half-Life 2 is one of the newer, in a very long line of evolution of first-person shooters where certain design standards have been adopted, right? And the one that's being used there for much of the game is, you know, you're in an arena, there's a locked door preventing you from going to the next arena yet, and you've got to, like, fight some monsters, or, you know, bring an object to a location which involves fighting off the monsters on the way there, or whatever, to open the way to the next arena, right? And that does a few things, right? That structure helps pace out the game. It helps the players understand what they need to do, right? They need to get through this arena and the next one and the next one all the way to the end. And it helps provide structure to balance the game, right? So
I wonder if
when
I
you
just
enter one
put
of these
this one up
arenas,
here.
or you know, say you have this fight, I don't know how good of a player you are, I don't know what difficulty level necessarily you're playing on, and how good that level is for you, but you're going to get a little different level of damage and hurt and use a different amount of ammo. I can put ammo on the other side of that door, and you can't use it in this fight, so there's some challenge, but as soon as that door unlocks, you'll get replenished,
need
right?
the extra animations.
So it provides structure to help me keep the level of challenge appropriate, right? The fact that you can't just walk to the end of the game. So this is very rigid first-person shooter structure happening.
I'm still not sure if I want these to be swapped and just re-rotated.
And one more thing to say about that is, you as the player have this idea in your head about what it means
it
to
would
be a
make
good
more
player of
sense,
this
so
game.
let me
This is kind
swap
of a
them
competitive game
here.
with a single player, right? If I'm good, it means I'm not getting hurt that much, I'm not dying, I have high health, I have a lot of ammo, I'm getting through these areas really fast, I'm killing these guys fast, and I'm going to get toward the end of the game because I'm going to beat the game, right? That's what it means to be a good player of this
And I just
game
need
mechanically.
to rotate those.
It's what the game mechanics are teaching you is important.
Turn left,
and so you get to one of these locked doors and you're like, man, I can't wait to get on the other side of that door because it means I'm good, because I'm getting further, and it means I'm good because I've got all these riches in terms of ammo and health and stuff, right? So that's all the game mechanics. The story is like, hey, there's this Alex Vance hot chick who we want you to empathize with, and you know, to accompany you through the game, and we want you to feel things for her. So we're going to have some kind of touching dialogue that happens, and maybe she'll tell you some other things about the world, about what happened while she was away and talk to some other characters and things to try to establish more story. She's like traveling story to go with you, right? Now these elements of story can't happen during the firefights, right? Because they don't know where you're looking. You're not going to be able to hear her because your machine's going off and it's really loud and there's like, you know, an alien beast jumping at your face. You're not going to be paying attention to what she's saying, right? So they have to, these story elements, large downloads of information and attempts to get you to care about the character have to happen between firefights, right? And what's between firefights? Those doors that you want to get through. So one of Alex's things that she does in Half-Life 2, especially the episodes, is she unlocks that door at the end of the arena, right? But she can't just go unlock it because she's got a monologue to deliver, right? So it's like, oh man, the door's jammed. Let me try and figure this out. By the way, did you hear that Dr. Kleiner got a new girlfriend, blah, blah, blah. And she's just talking and talking, right? Or it'll be like an elevator that takes an hour to get to the floor, and you're like, shut up, I want to get through the door, right? In terms of the game mechanics, all you want is to get through the door and get the things. You worked really hard, right, as a player. You took damage to get this reward that you know is on the other side of the door because you've been taught by the repetitiousness of the game design. And Alex is actually, even though the writers of the story and the animators and stuff are working really hard to get you to empathize with her, she's standing between you and your goal at every waypoint. So that's the fundamental tension.
Thank you.
Sure. You can see why I cut it. It's a really long explanation.
Actually, so strafing. I feel like now all of a sudden all of the animations are rotating from the back. Whereas when I let go of it.
Agile practices have transformed software development, making it faster and more aligned with business strategy and customer needs. But to succeed today, you need Agile for more than building software. You need Agile built into every part of your business, so you'll be collaborative and nimble at scale.
Paintings and music and sculpture.
There we go.
Welcome to a Rice University digital media production. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
I actually didn't do completely all of the programming. A friend helped me in the last 6 weeks of development, but yeah, basically.
Ants are a part of the most disciplined, dedicated social system on Earth. Until that is, they become slaves to behavior-controlling parasites.
All right.
Suddenly, these rogue ants no longer serve the colony. They're taking their orders from the parasite. Okay, let's back up. Now, how did this happen? It all begins when the ants in any town, USA, consume the slime of a passing snail. They divide it up and take it back to the colony. This is a blunder of epic proportions. Turns out, the slime is loaded with eggs of a body snatcher called the liver fluke, a type of flatworm. The liver fluke burrows.
Most realistic horse controls ever. Screw you, Witcher 3. Screw you, Kingdom Come. Screw you, video games.
And orders them to carry
The controls are so like I can actually control this horse and tell it to go where I want.
with a nice warm liver will do.
And I can turn all the time and it doesn't look ridiculous. I have a turn in place animation. Maybe it should just be adjusted a little bit more. Forward a little bit.
In easy to eat positions at dusk when mammals are feeding. No cows in sight.
Yeah, the pivot point needs to be a little bit closer to the front.
Ants are in essence ordered to take their positions in purple flowers and
Oh wait, it is here.
The cows ingest the vegetation.
It's more like this one needs to be.
The fluke larvae inside the ants all in one bite. Once inside the cow, the worms burrow out of the stomach and into the liver.
Actually, I think all of these animations need to be a little bit, because it's
they lay eggs
panning around like that.
from the liver into the bile duct.
Yeah, they're too far forward.
By the cows.
They don't kill the cows, but the cows become weak and emaciated.
Actually, maybe just the
herds.
forward running one.
And all because of parasitic mind control.
You can think about that for a second while I swap monitors.
Hopefully this doesn't mess up the normal running. Oh, it did.
Okay.
It didn't actually help this one. Did it? Nope. So let's take that one back.
So, I have the good fortune to be both a game designer and a programmer, right? And that's pretty cool, because what I do from day to day in my working life is I decide what to do, and then I just like type it in and make it work somehow on a computer, right? This is different from what a lot of people in games do, where they have to like get an idea and get permission to implement that idea, or else, you know, they have to do someone else's idea that they think is kind of stupid, right? Because of this, I have a lot of freedom in terms of what I work on, and what I've been doing for the past several years at least is figuring out ways to make games that I think are, you know, deeper than current video games or more meaningful than a lot of video games. But those kind of phrases,
so
like
when
deeper,
I'm strafing,
tend to set people on edge.
it's using
like,
control,
what's wrong with
rotation,
current video games? You're saying current video games aren't good. They're not deep. And so there's a phrase that I've sort of learned to adopt a little bit that helps discussions proceed without being argumentative, right? And it's this phrase, speaking to the human condition, right? This is a traditional thing that we say about art, right? When people talk about the good parts of films and novels and paintings and music and sculpture, and they talk about how these things can affect people deeply or change their lives or reveal truths to them, we'll say that these works speak to the human condition. But the magic of this phrase is that it's pretty vague, right? Nobody will agree, or even nobody knows exactly what it means. But that's actually part of what allows us to employ it usefully, right? To have discussions. It's a little bit of a paradox.
I guess it's on all of them.
But
so
I and
maybe
many other
just a
game
tiny
designers
nudge forward.
who are sort of in my school of thought, not my school of thought, but in a common school of thought, you know, we feel like games so far don't do a very good job of speaking to the human condition, whatever that means for each individual person, each individual designer. And so we're working on that. You know, we feel like games currently tend to be temporary diversions, right? Something I do for a little bit, but I don't really care about in the same level of magnitude as the things that are truly important in my life, right? And so the operative question for me is, can that ever be changed? Can games become a medium deeply important to people? You know, deeply important to more people than like a professional StarCraft player or something like that. So let me set some context for this discussion. I'm going to talk about a couple of really old games from the 1980s. This first game is Pac-Man. I think even
wait till the sun comes up, save it, and then make the sun take forever to
it's an arcade game. It's very simple. You run around this maze and you collect dots, and you try not to get killed by the ghosts, except sometimes you can turn around and eat the ghosts. It's a fun game. You know, even today, it's kind of fun to play. It had good game feel for the time, which is just the way the controls feel and the way the sound effects sync with the graphics and stuff. But, you know, people I know would not say that Pac-Man is right? This is not going to be a game that, like, you go, oh, it changed my life, right? It was really meaningful to me. No, it's a fun game, right? But it's just about running around a maze eating dots, right? Simple game. Here's another game. Most people probably don't know what this is. Does anyone know what this game is without reading the caption? No. It's a game called Impossible Mission. First platform it was released for was a Commodore 64, and it's a James Bond kind of game where you're infiltrating a evil genius's underground fortress to like stop a nuclear launch or something like that. This was pretty much the Halo of 1984 or something like that. In addition to being very ugly, though, by modern standards, it's also kind of unplayable by modern standards. You kind of take these elevators around, and you're trying to reach these obstacles on the level so you can like search them and find things, and you're trying to jump over these robots that shoot lightning out. And so it's all this like pixel perfect jumping and not falling into the gap and things like that. You know, which video games of today still use once in a while, but this game is like 100% pixel perfect jumping, and you get fried, and you have to restart at the save point and do all this hard stuff over again. It's all these things that, since then, us video game designers have learned not to do, because when you make things really difficult, when you throw a bunch of challenge at the player, but they can see that the thing you're challenging them with is relatively meaningless, like jumping over these stupid robots, then they tend to just stop caring about it very quickly, right? Now, the reason people loved this game back then is because this was new. Like, wow, I'd never played a game where I, you know, can pretend I'm James Bond and infiltrate this mountain fortress. But now we've played so many, I would say, better video games that nobody wants to go back and play this, right? So in the couple of decades since then, game designers as a community have learned some best practices to help them make games that are either more playable and more enjoyable by a wider audience than something like Impossible Mission, or things that are larger and more intricate and deeper than Pac-Man, right? And if I were to write out the full list of what game designers have figured out, it would be many, many pages. I mean, I could probably write books on it. Not that I would ever want to, but I've sort of picked 4 of the major things that all of you guys are going to recognize, assuming you've ever played a video game, right? The first thing that we learn to do is put story in a game in a very concrete, progressing way, right? The story of Impossible Mission is like, hey, you're a secret agent and you're trying to infiltrate this fortress, but that story doesn't progress. There's no plot points or anything. It's just you're trying to do this, and then you eventually solve enough puzzles and win the game. Humans like to hear stories. They you know, stories have a magnetism. We want to know what happens next. And what game designers have learned to do is take that desire to find out what happens next and help use it kind of as a rope to pull you along through a video game. Now, in addition to pulling you through the game, it has this secondary function, which is to justify what you're doing with a fictional excuse. If you play old school first-person shooters like Doom or games like that, really literally at the dawn of the first-person shooter, the way it would work is you're running around shooting a bunch of monsters, and you're trying to get to the end of the level, and you run into a door, and it's a red door. And you know that to get through the red door, you need to find the red card key, right? And so you go find that, and you go open the door, and you keep going, and eventually there's a blue door, and you know you need to find the blue card key, right? And that was literally the way these games were paced for a while after that, is just there's these relatively arbitrary game mechanical things preventing you from progressing. Now there's a green door, right? And you knew exactly what you had to do to get through the door, but there's no reason for it, right? Now we have games like, you know, Modern Warfare, where it's like, oh, we need to drive this tank to the next mission, but the tank's out of gas, and the guys are like infiltrating the fuel depot, so you need to like shoot a bunch of them and get in there and get some gas cans and bring it back to the tank and fill up the tank so our boys can drive on to the next mission. It's really the same thing as the red key and the red door, but now there's like this huge scaffolding around it to make it fictionally plausible and to try to make it engrossing, right? Another thing we've learned to do is add a bunch of eye candy and ear candy, like nice sound effects, to games, because human beings like visual and oral stimulation, aural stimulation. And you know, often the more of that, the better, even if it's subtle, even if you're looking at a game that's just a beautiful vista or something. It doesn't have to be explosions and bright fireworks going off everywhere, although many games take that approach, right? The more of that we have and the better synced it is to the sound effects, the more compelling the game ends up being. The third thing is how we keep people playing, which is not only do they have a long-term goal that helps them make sense of what they're trying to do, but you break that up into little bite-sized goals. So it doesn't feel like I'm trying to do this epic thing that I don't ever know when I'm going to accomplish it because I have a nearer step, right? So maybe, I don't know, the tank mission isn't a very good one because first-person shooter missions aren't this long, but just imagine that it was an hour-long mission and getting the gas can was the half-hour point, but there was like a 5-minute point of like, your first waypoint is to get up on the tower and scout out where the enemies are. Then you've got to go find the key, and then you've got to get open the warehouse, right? So you add these goals where the player always knows what they can do next, and it's a relatively easy thing. It feels well within their reach. And this keeps people playing. It's like, you know, just one more level, or if I just do this next thing, I'll be in a good spot so that when I save and go to bed and wake up tomorrow, you know, I'll be in a totally good position to keep going. And of course, they do that one thing, and then there's just one more next thing just within their reach.
I just gotta move the
and going, and you pull them through the game.
The camera, or maybe I can mount the camera onto the horse bone somehow.
Is this feeling of constant improvement that we've added to games, which
Let's see if I can snap it to one of these bones.
Probably the most familiar one is in role-playing games where your character has experience points, and you get enough of those, and his stats goes up, right? But that's actually, you know, a more Byzantine version of just score that we used to have in arcade games, right? Score provided a feeling of constant improvement because you could play again to get a better score, and usually that would work. But now instead of having it be a player skill,
I do like the way it leans a little bit out of the way, so maybe not there.
Which means it's more of a fictional thing in the game. So you're not improving your own
Horseman
skills,
bone.
you're improving the fictional skills of something in the game world. You're learning new spells, you know, you're getting more gold pieces, you're getting awesome magic items that like glow with fire, lots of eye candy when you run around, right? So hopefully all of that makes sense to everybody, and there's no surprises there. Now, to segue into the next part of the talk, I think it's important to say that this kind of collection and hoarding mechanism, which we see in RPGs originally, but it's starting to spread into a lot of different game types, especially casual games, is the way those rewards are scheduled. We tend to do it with things, if they're not exactly a Skinner box, they very closely resemble a Skinner box. And in case you don't know what a Skinner box is, it's something like this. It's an experimental setup where you have a mouse living in a box, and he can't get out. And every once in a while, some kind of stimulus plays, like a light goes off or a sound happens or whatever. And during those periods, if the mouse hits a lever, then a food pellet will come out, which whether it's delicious.
The beginning of In My Movie actually talks about this.
But then he learns that, right? And it's a way of training the mouse to perform this activity of hitting the lever when a stimulus occurs. And the interesting thing about Skinner boxes is if you give somebody a predictable reward, then the behavior is less well trained than if you give them a randomized reward.
Under the rabbit's eye, the rabbit would still blink. However, when a specific nucleus has been chemically deactivated, the rabbit would stop blinking. Now, later on, and I mean years after Lashley, an MIT study found that behavior based on high-level I've been trained to run through
engrams?
Yes, and okay. Yes, memories. The actual location in the brain where memories are stored. You do know about lab rats running through mazes. Listen, in the 1950s, there was a scientist named Carl Lashley who coined this term while looking for memories in the brains of lab rats that had been trained to run through mazes. Lashley was searching for engrams, physical imprints in the brain. And he did it by systematically removing portions of the rat's brain. I'm sure you have heard of classical conditioning. The whole eyelid response. Classical conditioning. Basically, you play a sound while blowing air into a rabbit's eyes, and then it'll start to blink. Now you continue to do that over and over and over again, and eventually, the next time you play the sound without blowing air into the rabbit's eye, the rabbit would still blink. However, when a specific nucleus has been chemically deactivated, the rabbit would stop blinking. Now, later on, and I mean years after last.
Right? So if every time the light goes on and the mouse hits the pellet once, or hits the lever once and the food pellet comes out, you know, that kind of works. You can train the mouse to hit the lever, but if he has to hit the lever an unknown amount of times, like a random number between 1 and 10, you're going to really train that mouse to compulsively press this lever when a stimulus happens, right? And probably most of you, oh, and in case you want to like shock the mouse or something, there's like an electric floor. I guess that's if you're really pissed off that he's not learning to press the lever. You can do a bunch of different experiments with this kind of setup. Anyway, you're probably more familiar with Skinner boxes in this kind of context where they don't have electric shock floors. But a slot machine is almost exactly a Skinner box in that it has a randomized reward schedule that's optimized to get you to put as many coins as possible into the slot machine. Or you might be more familiar with them in this context, which is a dungeon crawler
3 or 4 horses to mount up. I use different blueprint for each horse.
You know, a barrel or a crate, there's an unknown quantity of treasure inside. It might be completely empty. It might just have a couple of gold pieces, and you're like, ah, but it might have like 10 gold pieces, and you're like, oh,
the
awesome.
event tick must not be
I'm really on
overlooked
my way to
in
buying that
code.
next level of sword. So anyway, this game design best practices set here is going to be so useful to refer back to that I'm going to put it in a toolbox so I can carry it with us through the rest of the talk. But just remember what this stands for. This is all the good stuff that game designers have learned to do to make games compelling to play and more appealing to more people than the old style games used to be. So how did we arrive? How do we know these are best practices, right? How did we learn these? There are 2 ways. And one of the ways is very natural. And it's just this process of evolving inspiration that happens in the game designer community. Most people who want to design games are doing it because they like video games, right? So they have some particular game that they really liked a lot, and they're like, oh, that game was cool, but you know what? It would be even cooler like if the gun was bigger or something, right? I mean, that's not a very, you know, actually a real one is it would be really cool if you not only shot people, but you could shoot people with the gun, and you would like stake them to the wall so they're hanging on the wall afterward, right? Does anyone know that game? Yes. I don't know. Did someone say something else? It was Painkiller did it originally. Maybe somebody did it before Painkiller, but I don't know what game it is if they did that. So there's this process of taking something you thought was cool or interesting or neat and making it better, right? And that's a very, I'm going to say, innocent kind of motivation, right? It's a joyful kind of thing to take something that was there done by your predecessors and kind of stand on the shoulders of giants and make something even better. But over time, as game budgets got bigger and we became more professional, I put that in quotes because it's a word I really don't trust, we learned how to monitor players in a little bit of a better way. Because what was happening in the earlier days, even into the 90s, is we'd think that our game was great. You know, we did a really good job polishing it. You know, it's better, clearly better than the previous game. And then you sit someone down and they try to play it, and it's like totally unplayable. They can't get used to the controls that we got really good at because we're the developers and we've been using the controls for like years. They don't understand where they're supposed to go and what they're supposed to be doing when we thought we made all that stuff clear. So the method that we've come up with for dealing with this is to just silently watch players, right? You sit them down, they start playing your game, and usually they're going to start to have problems. And typically, the way that you deal with that, or the instinct for dealing with that is to help them out. Like, no, oh, sorry, you know, we didn't make the HUD for this clear enough, you know, do this thing or press this button. But you don't do any of that. You don't help them at all. You just sit there and watch them, right? And it's very painful to sit there and watch them, but you do it, and every time there's a little glitch or you know, they get confused, you write it down. And that gives you your to-do list for when you go and work on your game later, right? This is a sort of a, I will say, a little more scientific way of designing games than
So instead of attaching it to the bone, which was like really rickety, I liked it better when it was like loose there.
Cool, right?
It felt more realistic, like you're not glued to the horse, it should be like wiggle around underneath you.
I have to find where I am in my notes.
Oh.
Right. Okay, so imagine I've done all this, and I'm making some modern game, and it's a dungeon crawler game. And it employs a bunch of those things from that best practices toolbox, right? So it's got a treadmill of player stats that just go up and up and up, and equipment stats. You can get better and better swords and armor, and many different categories of equipment, right? And the equipment prices go up, and maybe you need gems for some of them, and maybe you need gems to like instill capabilities in different weapons. And then you kind of want to reclaim those gems, right? So there's kind of an intricate ecology of these improving stats on many different kinds of objects in the game, right? Then, like I said, we'll have a loot Skinner box where you kill a monster and a random reward pops out of the monster, or you open a chest and a random reward pops out. We have all these cool explosion effects and weapon trails and like, you know, lightning strikes and stuff like that. And we have all these little 5-minute quest milestones, so you always have a very tangible next thing to do. And we have this epic story about how there's this evil guy, the Foozle, who you have to go kill in the end, and you're the only person who can do it, right? So we do all those things. And we have a very compelling game. We know that. We can almost manufacture these off an assembly line now. But now do a certain thought experiment where you take that big list of things that I just said and take the same game, but strip all those items out of that game, right? So no big story about the Foozle, right? And no 5-minute quest milestones. They can be functionally there, but just don't put them in a player-leading kind of way, right? You take out the loot Skinner box and replace it with typical game balance. You take out all the non-necessary special effects. You make it something like chess, right? So chess is an abstract game. It doesn't particularly have eye candy or special effects. It certainly doesn't have an epic story, but it's considered to be a very compelling game, right? There's a core of chess that doesn't need anything from that toolbox that has fascinated people for many, many years, right? So imagine the dungeon crawl version of chess, right? What would that game be? And I don't mean game mechanically, right? I mean stripped down. Here's a graph. You know, in these games, you know, I mentioned the word treadmill a couple slides ago. The way these are very intentionally designed is we want the player to feel more and more powerful and like he's, you know, having progress. So he gets experience points and he gets better equipment and all that. But you know, if the monsters didn't get harder too, then the game would become trivially easy after like 15 minutes because we really pump stats through the ceiling, right? So what you do is you have them encounter harder and harder monsters over time, and the two go up roughly in parity, right? So what happens is if you graph the difficulty of the game over time, it's probably something like this, assuming the designer was reasonably skilled, where it starts out kind of easy, and then it ramps up after a sort of tutorial phase, and then it kind of oscillates for a bit. This line, this dotted line across the middle, is sort of what we think of as the difficulty of the game on average. And note that we actually don't make the difficulty lock to that line and go horizontally. And the reason is because that doesn't feel that good. You know, instead we set up a bit of an oscillation around this. So you have periods of intensity and then periods of relaxation and periods of intensity and periods of relaxation. This provides for a sense of drama in the gameplay, as well as actually allowing the player to feel powerful, right? Because if monsters are always perfectly matched to you, you never get to feel like this awesome sword that you got or the fact that you're level 17 matters, right? But if you feel more powerful for a little bit, and then that gradually wears away, people won't notice. So in some sense, this curve is about creating drama, and in some sense, it's about fooling the player into feeling like the treadmill is more real than it is. Anyway, so while you're doing all this stripping down of this game, you might as well downgrade the graphics, because that's all eye candy, right? It's not really necessary. So you probably get something that looks like an indie game, but it's all functional. You know, you can make the same game out of all that. So after you've done this, go take a poll, right? You know, game companies love to ask people what they want. You go take a poll of how many people want to play this game versus how many people want to play the awesome-looking AAA game that you started with. And what you find is very few people want to play this stripped-down game. You know, some people might. Very, very hardcore gamers might do it, but you lose most of your audience, right? That's all I'm going to say about that at the moment. Now, this is RPGs are a very complicated genre of game, right? Like I said, they have all these like intertwining things that we've learned how to weave together to create player motivation. So you can run this exercise again with a much simpler thing, and this might help convince you that what I'm saying makes sense, or it might help make the model make more sense, right? So think about slot machines again. Imagine doing the same stripping down process to a slot machine, right? So you get rid of all the flashing lights and ringing bells and sounds and stuff. And you know, you also get rid of the Skinner box, right? So you get rid of that reward schedule I was talking about. So you don't actually ever win any money from this slot machine. And just to make it fair, you don't put any coins in either. And it's actually better because now you don't lose money ever, whereas with a real slot machine, you're guaranteed to lose money over time. So this is a 100% improvement over the traditional slot machine functionally, right? So all that happens now, we've gotten rid of all these things, so it's a relatively plain looking box with still the dials in there with different shapes on it, and you pull the lever and the shapes spin, and either they match and the slot machine says, hey, you won, or they don't match and the slot machine says, oh, you didn't win, right? But whether you win or didn't win, you don't win anything, and you don't lose anything. So how many people would play that slot machine, right? You might play with it for a second as a novelty, but it's not something that people are going to be mobbing into casinos to play, right? And more to the point, it's not going to be something that, you know, state and national governments feel threatened enough by socially that they have to regulate it or outlaw it, right? Because it's become, by the time you take away the reward schedule, it's become a totally different device, even though mechanically it's the same device, right? So all those designer best practices that I was talking about can take something that's inherently boring and pointless, like a box where you pull a lever and don't really win anything, right? And turn it into something that's compulsive, right? Compelling. And the thing is, we can do this with video games as well, and you know, not just slot machines, right? In a sense, we figured out a way to engineer our way around boredom, right? And take a relatively pointless game that's just about like clicking on things and not doing anything real, and adding production values to it, and turning it into something that a lot of people want to play, right? And this is key, right? It's about, we've engineered our way around boredom to a certain point. And I'm focusing on boredom right now, but we've engineered our way around some other things. Like, we've engineered our way around frustration by just learning how to tune games really well and doing that player watching stuff that we saw before. Every time someone gets frustrated, like, oh, I can't beat this monster, you just make that level easier, right? So you iron out all these bumps, and eventually you get a very smooth play experience that a lot of people want to participate in. And we keep doing this in video games. Just keep getting better and better and more fun, and we all live happily ever after the end, right? Probably not. I certainly have issues with this, and I know other people who do as well. I said that we're engineering our way around boredom. What does that mean, really? I mean, there's a very obvious surface meaning to it, but like, what effect does that have? What does it really do? And to answer that, you have to know, like, well, what is boredom, right? People don't like boredom. They don't like thinking about boredom. They don't like being bored. But boredom is actually a healthy response to unproductive situations, right? Human beings have boredom as a response because of evolution, right? Boredom has survival value. What it's for is you get into a situation that's unproductive, right? Your senses aren't being stimulated. You're not learning anything about your new environment. You're just being surrounded by the same old stuff. And you get bored and you start getting jumpy and agitated, and that causes you to want to go do something new or go do something different, right? It causes you to go outside of your normal behavior patterns. So hopefully a lot of us are computer scientists in here. So if you're familiar with the hill climbing process, what happens in hill climbing is you'll often start going up a hill and then you get stuck at a local maximum, right? And you can think of boredom for human beings, to vastly oversimplify the situation, as being something like adding a simulated annealing step into your hill climbing process to allow you to get unstuck, right? You're in a place that's pretty good. You're not in any imminent danger or whatever, but you're bored. You start doing different stuff, and it jumps you around this graph to different places. And eventually, one of the places you jump may allow you to climb higher, right? So here's the point. Imagine that for some reason, we're playing that stripped-down version of the RPG that has none of the graphics and none of the player stats or anything, right? And in fact, it's so stripped down that looking at this graph, like when you kill a monster, you know, normally in an RPG you get loot and maybe some items and some experience points, which are all different progression things. Those are really just different ways of bumping you slightly along this drama curve toward the end of the game. They just do it in a way such that they camouflage that that's what's happening. We'll just get rid of all that stuff, right? Just every time you kill a monster, it just disappears without even a sound effect, because you know it disappeared. You don't see it anymore. And then you just slightly bump a pointer along this drama curve a little bit, right? So you do all that, and for some reason you found someone who's still playing this game. To use as sort of an example case for another thought experiment, right? And then you reverse that process and you add in all the production values to create something that's compelling, right? So it's not just the fact that we've engineered our way around boredom, but we've taken this evolutionary mechanism that was a defense for human beings, right? That was a thing that they use to increase their survival value, to improve their quality of life, and we're redirecting it, right? So instead of improving the things about their own quality of life, they're now improving imaginary things in an imaginary world, right? But they're still exerting, time and effort, right? It's just the effort is going somewhere different now. Now, in the process of going somewhere different, what happens to it? Well, a lot of it just is in this imaginary world, but some of it goes into the game designer's and game publisher's wallet, right, in the form of, whatever, maybe a micropayment, maybe the price of the game, and whatnot, right? So if you think about this objectively, right, engineering your way through a human defense and then profiting by that is a parasitic form of behavior. But I'm a game designer, right? And I don't necessarily want to think of myself as a parasite. And a lot of game designers, if you were to say this to them, they would say, well, hey, we're not parasites because people genuinely enjoy our games. And they pay us for what we do, voluntarily. But maybe those ants, the subjects of parasitic mind control at the beginning of the video, maybe they're really enjoying themselves while they hang from that purple flower and get eaten, right? The fact of whether they're enjoying themselves or not is almost immaterial to whether something devious is going on. But taking a measured view toward this, right, and not just trying to flog it for controversy, I do find that, even if you believe this argument that what we're doing is circumventing human defenses, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? We circumvent human defenses for good purposes all the time, right? So say, for whatever reason, your liver's failing and you need to get a transplant, you go to the doctor, he'll operate on you, and what does he do? Well, he circumvents his way through your pain defense, right, by giving you some anesthetics. He cuts you open with a scalpel. He jiggers around in there, right, and then hopefully you're better at the end of that process, and you give him some money, right, and he takes that money and puts it in his wallet. But you can think of a parallel situation, or a parallel in many ways, where you're just in a bar and you're trying to get home at night, and there's a mugger there, and at first he gets around your social defenses, maybe just by hiding or by appearing to be unthreatening until you get close. And then he gets through your physical defenses, and he cuts you open with a knife and takes some money of yours and puts it in his wallet, right? They're very similar situations, but the ultimate difference really is whether this process of circumventing the defenses and getting the money in response was of benefit to the person being circumvented or was harmful to the person being circumvented, right? Now you might also, my first thought when I was thinking about this was, well, maybe it doesn't really have to do with benefit and harm. Maybe it's just about whether it's voluntary or not, right? Like you hopefully voluntarily went to the doctor, and you hopefully didn't voluntarily get mugged. But we can do another thought experiment to prove that that's not the case, right? So imagine there's some confidence man. You don't know he's a confidence man. You just meet him out on the street, and he's like, oh, my wife's sick, and I've got to go get on a plane, to go take care of her, but I lost my wallet, and it had my plane ticket and all my credit cards in it. But I need money to go see her right now, and I've got this really nice watch, right? It's a gold watch. Surely at a pawn shop, you could get $200 for it. So why don't you give me $100 right now, and then I can go get on the plane, and you'll make a profit, and everybody's happy. And he's very convincing. He has a great personality, so you believe him. You give him $100, he gives you the watch, and 5 minutes later, you're down the street at the pawn shop. By the way, he's jumped in a cab, and he's gone ostensibly to the airport. And at the pawn shop, you find out the watch is fake, right? And you got ripped off. but you voluntarily entered into that business transaction, right? But it's still a crime, right? It's still fraud. He still did something that was a crime, right? So let's extend this thought experiment. Let's think of another confidence man. He's a little better than the earlier guy, right? And he plays for higher stakes. He works on Wall Street, and he offers to invest your money for 5 years and give you great returns at the end of that 5 years. And you're like, sounds great. I've got this money in the bank, didn't know what to do with it. Now I know. So you give him $100,000, and he gets in a cab and goes away. And unbeknownst to you, he gets on a plane and flies to Thailand to live off your money for the rest of his life. But he has an assistant who every month for the 5 years mails you a statement with an imaginary number in it that's getting higher and higher, showing that, yes, your money is creating profit, and you're going to be really happy at the end of these 5 years. And so you're happy over the intervening time. And of course, the 5 years expires, and the guy's nowhere to be seen, and you realize that all your money has been stolen, and then you're very unhappy at the end of that period, right? So now there's a crime, but you didn't know it was a crime for a long time, but it's still pretty bad, right? $100,000, I don't want that stolen.
That's the most bizarre thing going on right here.
But again, you voluntarily entered into that, and you didn't have a problem with it for a while, right? But it's still a crime. So while I'm still in the midst of this whole foray here, just to remind of the point that I'm trying to make is that I'm saying that, at least in the context of game design, what I want to think about is benefit versus harm and not voluntary versus involuntary. So the third case, he's maybe the best confidence man of all, right? And he makes a deal with you. You enter into some kind of nebulous business arrangement with him. And there's never anything clearly wrong. He's just so good at taking things from you in a very, very subtle way that you never notice, just little droplets of money at a time, that you never figure out that anything's happened for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, your whole life, right? You live to be 75, 85, 95, whatever's a good old age when you're old, right? And you die happy. But the fact is that you actually die kind of poor, and you actually could have been much richer if this guy hadn't been stealing money from you for your whole life. But he was so good at it that you never even imagined that anything was wrong. You never imagined that you could have had more money and lived a more healthy, fulfilled life with that money if you know how to spend money properly. So it's not even the realization that you were wrong that makes it a crime, right? There's something about people mistreating people that makes something a crime, or that makes it unethical, or however you want to think about that. So to start to lead into where that's going, the way I feel about games is there's a sort of a spectrum, right? There are many spectra, but the one I want to talk about has on the left here games that have some kind of core to them that are intrinsically meaningful, like chess. You can strip away all those designer best practices, and chess is still a very compelling, interesting game, right? And then all the way on the right side of the spectrum are games where if you stripped away all that stuff, they're basically completely meaningless. Nobody in their right mind would really want to play them, right? And obviously, there are lots of points in between that games can occupy. To pick another example, right? Besides
I can't do
chess,
sockets.
We'll go to Go, which is even more minimalistic than chess.
Oh, it is
It has
world
even
location. I can do that.
rules. It uses absolutely none of the best practices from that toolbox, and yet many people will tell you it's the greatest game ever made, right? So obviously, these best practices are not about making an inherently good game, right? They're about something else. They're orthogonal to whether the game is good. They're about convincing people to pay attention to your game and want to play it, and about giving them feelings of compulsion regarding your game, or not, right? And when I put things on the spectrum, I don't even think this is an absolute property of games, that some of them are inherently, that everybody should evaluate these games the same on the spectrum, right? Because part of a game's value to you is whether it brings you a new experience, whether it makes you think about something in a new way. And the first time you play a certain kind of game, it probably does bring you a new experience. So even something like Farmville is probably cool to play for like 5 or 10 minutes, right? But for most people, most of the time, I would say that it lands about as far toward the right side of the spectrum as you can get, although, what the hell? You know, history keeps marching on, and we'll see what game developers come up with, you know, 10 years from now. So,
damn it. Oh.
So my point with the spectrum is, even though everybody's different and everybody has different opinions about what's valuable in a game or what they liked about a game or what's cool about it, it still is possible to generally classify things and generally make judgments about things, not only as an audience, but as a game designer. You can look at a spectrum and say, you know, I really want my work to be over here. I don't want my work to land over here, right? So just because people have different opinions doesn't make that impossible. Now, there's a reason I bring up Farmville, and it's because it's really bugging me lately. You know, a few years ago, I gave a talk about World of Warcraft and how I thought that was pretty much a bad idea. But Farmville is way worse, actually. Not only because it has a bigger audience of more mainstream people, but because of the way it operates intentionally. The way Farmville is designed to operate is much more dastardly than the way World of Warcraft is designed to operate. And to explain this, I'm going to read a quote from Ian Bogost, who's a professor at Georgia Tech.
I don't know why
he made a game called Cow Clicker, which is a parody of these kind of Farmville games, which we'll look at in a second. But the way he explains it is, you know, many of today's, he starts by talking about traditional single-player console games, right? Many of today's console games exert a time crush. They demand tens or even hundreds of hours of attention to complete,
give him more
some or most of which offer
writing, yeah, me too.
In that respect, one could argue that many games seem to destroy time. But social games do something even more violent. They also destroy the time we spend away from them through obligation, worry, and dread over.
I don't have auto run set up on this character.
Now, if you haven't played these games, you might not know how they do it. Hopefully, some of you in this room have not played these games.
I can't turn.
This is Frontierville, which is a new version of Farmville that was launched recently. And just like a dungeon crawler RPG has a lot of different things woven into it to get you to behave in certain ways, so also does this game. And it's insidious in a few different ways. It's got this, you know, it's got that little energy bar up at the top with the lightning bolt. That's how many moves you have, right? And you can spend all those moves probably in 1 or 2 minutes, but it's not enough to really accomplish everything you wanted to do when you sat down to work on your farm. So you've got to wait for the moves to refill, but they don't refill very fast, right? It takes probably, you know, I don't know exactly how long, but it's probably 3 or 4 hours for that bar to fill all the way up, right? So you want to spend those moves before the bar fills up, but the problem is if you go to sleep or you go watch a movie or something like that, you're going to start wasting moves because the bar is going to fill up at 14 here in this picture, and then you just won't get any more turns after that. So it's like you want to check in with Frontierville every 3 hours and spend your moves, because otherwise your farm is just not getting as good as it would get otherwise, right? The other thing it does that's pretty evil is that crops wither in this game, right? So you plant crops. The way it works is you buy a crop for a certain amount of money, you go plant it, you come back later and harvest it, and you get more money. It's a very simple loop. But the crop withers after a certain amount of time if you don't come harvest it, right? So that suddenly makes you very worried to come check in at the game, like, oh, you know, I was going to play tonight, but I'm running late in traffic, so I'm going to whip out my, you know, my iPhone and play Farmville on there so I can get my crops so they don't wither, right? These things are designed to make you worry about the game even when you're not playing the game. So Cow Clicker, which I've got a screenshot here, is, I only realized this today for some reason, but when I was talking about that strip down a game exercise, that's exactly what Cow Clicker is. It takes this genre of games and boils them down to the absolute essential. There's a cow, your cow that's in the middle of the screen, and you can click it. But instead of having a bunch of moves, you get one click. That's all you get, and then a 6-hour timer starts, and 6 hours later you get another click, right? If you buy the in-game currency, which is Mooney, right, then you can spend that to get other clicks faster, right? So then you can click on your cow. And then if you invite friends into your pasture, you can all earn Mooney, right? So it's got all this, the same, you know, attempted virality that all of these games have. And of course, to amplify that virality, every once in a while, you know, you click the cow and it says, hey, you clicked your cow. Do you want to share the fact that you clicked your cow with your friends? And you do that, and then it goes into your friend feed like that. Hey, I'm clicking a cow. Okay,
it's actually doing
funny,
the opposite when I turn the camera.
The reason that it's funny is because that's exactly what these games are, right? So you play Frontierville, and well, this is an email pestering, but it pesters you to sign up for emails. And then you're in there and like, oh, I'm gonna clean up my garden, so I'm gonna clobber this fox that's keeping me from doing anything. And then it's like, oh, you clobbered a fox, nice going.
So
you want to share that with your friends.
Blueprint,
and it does this all the time. Like if you haven't played this game, in the middle of those 14 moves, you probably get like 3 nag swings like this. Not an exaggeration. So you can barely even do what you're trying to do.
And I want his direction.
So anyway, that alone would be dangerous enough, right? The fact that game designers have now maybe crossed some ethical line where they're explicitly designing games for you to be worried, right? Explicitly designing them to decrease the quality of your life when you're not playing them.
Wait.
That's what they do. Oh, you know, okay, so I didn't finish making my point, which is just that as not good of a game design as I think World of Warcraft is, it's at least made in some way that's more innocent than that, right? Like the guys who make World of Warcraft like running around killing monsters with swords and stuff, right? And they envision some kind of audience that is like them, who would also like that kind of game. And even though it's a giant endeavor that's, you know, at some point no longer about pure joy when you're toiling to make a game, that's kind of what they're doing. They're making games for people who kind of like the same kind of thing that they do. Okay, I don't want to single out Farmville and Frontierville, but at any of the companies who make these games in a high-stakes kind of way, nobody there thinks this is a good game, right? They're not trying to make games for people to enjoy. They're simply trying to maximize either the amount of money they get in from a user or the amount of virality they get from that user to contact other users, or both. That's all they care about. And that's obvious by looking at the game design, right? If they wanted Frontierville to be more fun, there's a bunch of things they could do. They could give you more moves. They could even move to a system where your number of moves isn't limited, so you can just kind of tend your farm however you want, right? But that would make it less addictive. And their goal isn't enjoyability, it's addictiveness, right? They could nag you less. They could, like this screen pops up right in the middle of whatever you're doing. Like you're going to run over and grab a piece of pie, and it's like, hey, share this with your friends.
So if you're not actually
they can stop nagging you while you're in the middle of something and save the window for later. But they know that if they do that, you're like less in the moment and are less likely to respond or to assent to this kind of virality. Okay, so that would be evil enough, right? But we have new technology that makes it even easier, right? In the old days, making video games was like you worked for a while on something, and you finish it, and then you deliver it to somebody's door. And you're like, here's my video game. Do you like it? And a lot of the time they say no, but hopefully you sell enough of them, right? Now it's not like that, because now we have games on the internet. And games on the internet do this thing called A/B split testing to maximize profit. Web guys love this. Who knows what this is in the audience? Okay, small percentage, so I'll explain it. This is basically another kind of hill climbing algorithm, right? Where instead of delivering one product to everybody, you split your audience into, let's say, 2 random samples, right? Completely random.
Before it was bending the other direction.
You give half of them version A of the
way
game,
better.
And half of them version B of the game, right? Just like any scientist running a control in an experiment and then an experiment.
That's why it was so wonky.
And what kind of things might you change between version A and version B? Well, maybe it's like the background color, right? To see how that affects.
It could be faster, though. You're right. Maybe this is the standard speed. We'll make the faster horses faster.
Maybe it's like, you know, how much gold do I get for punching a fox? You know, and maybe it even varies by region.
It's good, though,
maybe,
right?
Like, Americans like the game more if you get this much gold for punching a fox, but Europeans like it more if
I think that was the problem with Kingdom Come Deliverance. They were using their turn left and turn right without changing it if you're not pressing the button.
And how much new money they get from you buying, you know, micropayment kind of thing.
That's still wonky.
That's what they're measuring with this A/B testing. And so what you do.
But really, that's more like I'm going
you see which one works better, and you throw
this
the other
way.
Away, and then you start again. You put out 2 more versions.
I need the left mouse button now to pan the camera around.
Tree, and you're constantly optimizing your game all the time. Now, A/B testing by itself is not that new of a thing. You know, if you worked for a candy company in the 80s and you wanted to make a new candy bar, that's kind of an expensive endeavor to like ship that out to everybody in the USA. So what you do is you maybe make 2 versions of the candy bar and you put them in test markets, right? Like one of them is like Burlington, Vermont, and the other one is like, you know, Fresno, California or something.
My
right?
voice.
And you see how those do in various markets, and then if one of them is successful enough, you like start selling that nationally. You scale it up. That takes a long time to do. Compared to today, when you have web stuff, any company who has the user base the size of one of these very popular games like Farmville or whatever can run a very meaningful A/B test in a day, or in 6 hours, or even in 1 hour, right?
You mean
so
raise, like make it louder?
Actually bounded by the time it takes to actually run the test now. It's more bounded by like, you know, infrastructure issues at the company, like how quickly can they put the test together to make sure they're not breaking everybody's thing? How quickly can they decide even what they want to test, right? So remember back before that I was saying we used to design games just by doing what we thought was cool. Imagine that's a weapon like a bow and arrow or something. And then we got a little more scientific about it. You know, we decided to watch people in a more empirical and observant way without trying to influence them, right? And imagine that's a weapon like a flintlock rifle. What you've got now on the web is something like this, where it's just firing all the time, right? And that, at some point, the difference between this and this is not just a difference in quantity of projectiles, right? At some point, a quantitative difference becomes qualitative, right? At some point, you can just do totally different things with this new weapon than you could have done with the old weapon, right? And what kind of things can you do? Well, you know, maybe you're not firing actual bullets, but you're doing psychological experimenty things and profiting off them. So there's another interesting thing that I think that's interesting about game design, is that game design is kind of a game by itself, right? I've made a bunch of puzzle games, and I found that like looking at a situation and saying, how do I make an interesting puzzle out of this, is itself a really interesting puzzle, right?
Okay.
So there's this huge irony going on, that the companies that are making these social games that basically have no gameplay value in them, right, are actually themselves playing a much more interesting game than the game that they're making for you to play, right? The game they're playing is this huge multi-dimensional optimization problem where you're like trying to gather data and make the best decision and all that, and the game they're making for you to play is like clicking on a cow a bunch of times and you get some gold, right? So that's, you know, very, very strangely humorous. And as I visualize that happening, right, somebody at one of these companies, they're doing their A/B testing, they're kind of tweaking something for Europe and tweaking something for America and tweaking something for Canada, and then going over here and like, oh, this A/B test is done, let's look at the graphs of the results and let's write a report on that and stuff. You know, it's a little bit like planting trees and rearranging a garden and like minding livestock and all that, right? So you could say that the people making Farmville are not only playing a game, but they're playing some kind of like Farmville that is way more interesting, right? And so the sad fact of what this all comes to is you've got these people, you know, Farmville has a wide demographic. It's not just computer nerds who play it apparently anymore.
Oh shit, I have the...
who think that they're playing
oh
this
shit,
cool
this
game,
is the...
you know,
that
they
is supposed to be
mind
checked,
their
this is
cows
supposed to be
and they're feeling like
unchecked.
the boss, and they're getting all this
Supposed to
gold,
be
and they're
checked.
getting richer, and their farm is looking nicer. There's all these ways that they feel like they're progressing, but what's actually happening is that someone is farming them, right? So, you know, there's all these imaginary farms out there.
I'll be right back.
Where you gain imaginary money, but then there's a real farm with real money that pulls, you know, it pulls money from you over the internet.
That's fine, I didn't mean to disconnect. I hope I didn't lose my 8 viewers. But I'll show you how everything is now. Just has to... I want to compile and save these. Yes. Alright, check this out. We'll make a new character. For all you lucky viewers out there. Oh, it's down to 3 now. There were 5 people. I'll still play it for you guys, don't worry. I won't let you down. So it takes less time for one process, more time for the other. They're back. My viewers are back. So I'm going to show off the horsey and the deer one more time. And the intro area. Whatever. Can't spell, who cares?
Welcome.
That's just cool as hell, isn't it? Anyway. Maiden. Oops. Females. Did I for some reason write a special one just for females? That's the first time I've looked at that. I think it's the only one that has a gender description. I have to fix that. Take the gender thing out of there. I had like male and female differences in descriptions, but then I was like, you know what? I don't need to come up with differences between the genders, socially speaking, for each race. But then I thought maybe I could. That's actually a cool name, intro. That one doesn't really work so well with the postures, unfortunately. I might have to take it out or rework it or something. Alright, chill. I hit auto run. I don't know, I think it's helped the sense of wonder at the size better when I didn't block off the distance with cliffs. It felt like it went off into infinity. But that had that weird jitter. But I wonder if I fixed the jitter by fixing the ocean. Didn't really quite fully fix the ocean though, there's still some lines out there. Anyway. That's my game world. Oh, that looks so much smoother now. Yeah, I fixed the spawn areas. So now I can pan the camera, it doesn't turn. When I hit right mouse button, his legs don't randomly fly out. So I fixed a lot of animation stuff. So yeah, I was showing my mom. In the animation blueprint, I think I want to just change one little thing. Oh, 2D blend space. Yeah. Maybe make this higher. No, makes it faster. Wait, let's try that. Because it's basically, it has to go past a pose that is opposite from where it is. And I don't want it to actually hit that one. But speed, I think higher is the opposite of what I want. See, it's going to like out here. I don't know why though. What's the next one that would have to go to? Oh, I guess the turning one is going to turning. Because I'm looking this way right now. So as it comes out of here, it's going turning and then I don't know, I guess. No, because I do like the way that happens when you're running, so I don't want that. Maybe I can just fix the blend weight. Here. I wonder if making it higher helps, or just go down, back down to 1 maybe. Pardon me. Oh yeah. Okay, so okay, it's not that, it's how fast it transitions into it. That was really funny though. Just looked funny. So this was better, and it was at 2. I think 3 was the first crazy one I did. Actually, 3 might be even better. It's faster. Compare them again, real quick. Knowing now that this does not affect what I was actually trying to fix, but that this is worth setting to the correct thing anyway. Okay, so I think what I can do is on the blueprints in here. I know we can look these things up, but I'll just do like a longer one. Maybe the strafing blend could be increased too. In and out. more like a character control thing when you press the button off and on. Alright, Flick is now hosting my stream with 7 viewers. Well, hello there. Take a look-see before I go messing with codesies. That's cool. Flick and all of his mighty followers. You're now mine. I've consumed you. Not 3, not 4, not 5, but 7. 7 swords! What was that? Flick is now following. Cool. So, wait for the grass to pop in for it to look tremendous and amazing. Grass has to load, and ignore the fact that he's wonky. She's wonky. We'll just play as the horse for now. Wait for that grass, damn it. There you go. Alright, so I'm working on this horse thing. Yeah? So, I'm trying to blend in between everything now, basically, but also it's a really terribly made horse, pants while running, which is awful. But it's okay, we can fix that. It jumps right now, but it doesn't have I haven't put the animation in. And this is awesome. Whee! Somebody said it could be faster, and I agree, but when you have footsteps and wind sound effects, I think that'll be enough. I don't want players to be feeling like they can just get wherever they want on horseback. It's more of like a energy saving thing, a stamina thing. I was skidding, but technically when you skid you do this. So you might be running along and think, I'm skidding, but actually your horse is just like that. Oh, here's some idle animations while I take a hit. I have a really cool working day-night system, but I have it slowed down to like nothing right now, just so I can have some light. But I have a moon with phases, blood moon, horizon, fog, color, all this cool stuff. So anyway, what fuzz was I doing? Let me just throw this out here for you guys. Oops. All that. Come join us.
I am eccentricity slaps I am eccentricity around a bit with a large trout.
I have a lot of people on here. So, on here, basically, if it's 0, I want to interp down to 0 instead of just setting it immediately. But if it's not 0, I want to set it immediately. So, 0, true. Do an interp to float. F interp 2. Current. Let's see. I want it here. I don't think that's controller yaw input. I want movement yaw. Okay, so this should be good. Then I'm also gonna want to set it here. I'm gonna do it here before I boop. Current would be actually move right. Oh, it's literally all in it. Delta time, delta time. Why do I have to plug you in? And we'll make it quick, but for now, let's make it, knowing how speeds work, 5 may be good. Now that I finally know how speeds work. Burp. If you're not 0, do the thing. If you are 0, do this thing. No, wait, from here. Yeah, sorry. Okay. That's it better. Target. That would be here. I can just make this not equal 0. Then I can switch these and be a lot cleaner. Bit cleaner. So much cleaner. Alright. Let's see if that does it. Can turn down the interp speed of that now that I have this beautiful fix. I think I can slow this down to, or speed this up a bit. Let's try 10 first. See this still working. I can't believe that worked. guess normally it's 0. Let's see how that works. Maybe make it like 0.02 or something. It's pretty good. So yeah, that's I think that's it for now. Ah, that's so many people. Intro again real quick.
Welcome to the halls of creation.
Oops. There's a horse loose in spawn. No. No, not a horse in spawn. Alright, that's it for today. Hey, what's up? What you looking at? This guy over here? I wanted to click on the NPC so you could see my dialogue window, but I think this is good enough. And he's like, what the hell? What are you doing here? And you notice this is a good thing. The statues aren't activating by anything but except for the third person character. So this horse, it's kind of funny that I can play a horse in here and it isn't triggering any of my crazy shit. I can't tell if the sky is on. I guess the sky isn't on. So it's not triggering those overlaps. I have to make sure those overlaps go towards other classes than humans as well. So if you look up, the sky is blue in those lights, but I bet if I go over here it'll still be blue. That overlap won't work. Unless it's just other actor. Oh no, I think it works. Does this one not work then? Where's the smoke stuff? I don't see the smoke stuff. The weird, creepy smoke stuff. Oh well. This is video gaming. I have a horse in spawn area. Signing out. Although I want to work more. I really do. I'm just gonna like take a quick walk. Just, you know, from my back. I'll be back. I promise. One more thing if you're still here. Go check out this movie that I made in New York and Eastern Europe and got distributed on Amazon Prime. I'm on Facebook as well with it. It's on Prime, so if you have Prime, it's free. I'm just gonna leave with the trailer. Actually, let me see. The newer trailer, yeah.
That's Sam.
Okay, so we are looking for an American blonde girl in a Polish city.
Yes. Shouldn't be too hard.
Yeah, sure.
I'm sure you have heard of classical conditioning. The whole eyelid response.
An MIT study found that behavior based on high-level cognitions, such as the expression of specific memory, can be generated in a mammal by the physical activation of small subpopulation of brain cells. By simply shining a light on these brain cells, long-term fear-related memory appears to be recalled. Engrams.
You think you can cure depression? You know, it sounds like it would be good for remembering traumatic events. Repressed memories long forgotten.
What do you mean she, like, ran away?
Well, we had a little falling out, and then she actually, well, actually nobody really knows where she is, because the police found her car next to a river and with nobody in it, so... But I think she's out here, somewhere, traveling around, and I'm gonna find her.
I sincerely hope you find her. I really do.
Thank you.
I really do.
Thank you. You know, she might actually be here.
So, yeah. That's the shit. You gotta go see it. Now I'm out. I'll be back.